Your poor-ass daddy is just good at hitting on the drunk boss lady. The harsh, raspy laugh ripped through the break room. Darius Cole stood frozen, his hand bleeding from how tightly he clenched his fist. Next to him, his daughter Lena clung to his arm, eyes brimming with tears. By the next morning, the filthy rumor had spread across the company. Single dad seduces drunk boss. Watch now to see how a poor single father turns humiliation into a counterattack, exposing the fake power behind the mask. The hotel lobby was still glowing under the chandelier lights. The music had softened, but the air was thick with the stench of alcohol and cigarettes. Young employees clustered in groups, their laughter slicing through the silence like knives aimed at the man standing alone. Darius Cole kept to a shadowy corner near the exit, his large, calloused hand gripping tightly onto the small, delicate hand of Lena. The 10-year-old wore a simple dress, her face still lit with excitement from attending her father's company party for the first time. But that joy quickly faded as the glances of colleagues swept over them cold and distant, as if the two of them didn't belong in this world. Darius heard the whispers clearly, the half-hidden jabs no one bothered to conceal. One man from the sales team, wineglass in hand, looked straight at him and spat out a bitter line. "Brought your kid to the party? Too broke to hire a babysitter?" The group erupted into laughter, the sound echoing through the already noisy space, making Lena lower her head, her small hand trembling in his grip. Darius drew in a deep breath, holding back the words burning in his throat. He was used to this kind of talk, the disdainful looks, the bitter smirks society reserved for men like him because of his skin and his status. He knew that if he answered, even with just one sentence, the whole room would turn into a battlefield, and he'd be the one to pay the price. But when he looked down and saw Lena's small shoulders tremble, he tightened his grip on her hand, as if to remind her he was still there, still her only anchor. Just then, the space seemed to shift with a crash. Victoria Hale, the company's powerful boss, stepped away from the banquet table. Her designer dress was crumpled, her heels wobbled like they might collapse. The wine glass in her hand shattered on the stone floor, red liquid spreading into a dark stain, and the laughter that followed was even louder, more vicious than before. Even the employees who had stayed quiet now joined in, whispering mockery with a kind of glee in their voices, enjoying the downfall of the once cold, commanding woman now stumbling like someone stripped of all authority. Darius stood there and, for a brief moment, saw the cruel irony. Two people, at opposite ends of the power spectrum, now reduced to punchlines in the same room. Lena looked up, eyes wide, filled with both fear and confusion as cruel laughter circled around them. The scene felt like salt poured into an old wound in Darius's heart. He didn't need to say anything. Everything was already painfully clear. In this place, a person's worth was measured by appearance, money, and power, while decency was nothing more than a cheap trinket thrown to the floor. Yet in the silence, his eyes burned with resolve. He knew this was just the beginning of a long night, a night that would change everything. Victoria staggered a few more steps, the clatter of her heels on the stone floor blending with the mocking laughter around her. Someone let out a shrill voice. So, this powerful boss lady's nothing but a drunk mess. No one moved to help her, not a single hand reached out. And when she tilted, about to fall, Darius instinctively stepped forward, his arm quickly wrapping around her to steady the unbalanced body. In that moment, the laughter seemed to pause, frozen mid-air, until a voice dripping with contempt broke the silence from the direction of security. "Get your filthy hands off her, you lowlife. You think you've got the right to touch her?" Lena clutched her father tightly, her voice trembling. "Dad, they really hate us." And Darius understood the real storm was only just beginning to rise. The sound of breaking glass hadn't even faded when loud laughter erupted from the crowd. A young employee, face flushed red from alcohol, raised his glass high and shouted for the entire hall to hear. "So, the powerful boss lady turns out to be just a drunk hag." The crowd around him burst into laughter, their voices overlapping, drowning out the background music. Those who had spent the past year, under Victoria's strict rule, suddenly saw a chance to vent, and they did it by piling their scorn on a drunken woman who could no longer defend herself. Victoria stumbled, her hand reaching for a nearby chair but slipping off, leaving a smear of red wine across the tabletop. Darius stood a few steps away, still gripping his daughter's hand, feeling the pounding rhythm of Lena's heartbeat through her tiny fingers. He hadn't planned to intervene, knowing one wrong move would shift every hateful gaze toward the two of them, but his body reacted before his mind could stop it. He stepped forward when he saw Victoria tilt hard to one side, her heels clacking like a warning knock before a fall. Just then, a security guard appeared, marching toward Darius, his pale face flushed with red, the stench of liquor hanging heavy on his breath. He jerked his chin and growled through a smoker's rasp. "Back off. You don't belong near her, you low-class trash." The words cut through the noisy air like a blade. Darius turned to face him, eyes locked, but said nothing. He knew anything he said now would be twisted, used as more fuel for humiliation. Lena clutched his hand tighter, her small face going pale as she watched the way they looked at her father. Victoria couldn't stay upright. Her body swayed forward, and the laughter rose again, louder and meaner. In a flash, Darius moved in, his arm catching her just before she collapsed onto the cold marble floor. As he held her up, the crowd's taunts rang out like gunshots. "Look at him, trash boy seizing his chance." One voice cracked from yelling, "Get your filthy hands off her." The shout slammed into Lena's ears, making her flinch as tears filled her eyes. Victoria was too drunk to register what was happening. Her head drooped onto Darius's shoulder, the heavy stench of alcohol stinging his nose. The crowd stared down like spectators at a circus. They didn't care about the truth. All they needed was an image to feed their cruelty. A once powerful woman now stripped of dignity, and the only one catching her was the black employee they all looked down on. A man in the back drove the mockery deeper, his voice dripping sarcasm. Maybe he thinks he's some fairy tale hero, saves the princess, and gets a reward. Darius heard it all, but held back. He knew he couldn't let Victoria fall into this pit of shame. Lena whispered, her voice breaking with fear. "Dad, they really hate us." The words stabbed through Darius like a blade. He lowered his head slightly to look at her, his eyes holding the quiet strength forged through years of endurance. He answered her only with a squeeze of the hand, as if to say that even if the whole world turned on them, they still had each other. Victoria was helped to stand more steadily, but she remained dazed, her head swaying, mumbling incoherent words. The crowd behind them slowly began to disperse, but not without leaving behind sharp bursts of laughter and whispered comments thick with smug satisfaction. To them, this moment was the perfect after-party entertainment, a rare chance to humiliate both the boss and the underdog at once. The security guard still blocked Darius's path, his voice low and tight. "I told you to let go. Didn't you hear me?" Darius didn't respond. He simply adjusted his stance, holding Victoria more firmly to keep her from falling again. He knew his silence would be misunderstood, but if he let go now, the consequences would be far worse. The younger employees started giggling again, one of them raising a phone, clearly intending to capture the scene. Darius realized that if this image spread, the story would spin far beyond anyone's control. His eyes scanned for a way out, quickly thinking of how to get Victoria away from the crowd, not just to shield her from public shame, but to protect himself and his daughter from this cruel spectacle. But as he took another step, a voice rang out, cold as steel. "Don't even dream of using this as your ticket out, you low-grade black trash." In the laughter and spiteful words, Darius understood that tonight wasn't just about Victoria's disgrace. It was a moment that would decide his own dignity. There was no turning back, and every pair of eyes watching would be a witness to how he faced this humiliation. Lena still trembled, but when she felt her father's grip never loosen, she looked up, her tear-filled eyes reflecting the chandelier's light, as if searching for a sliver of hope in a sky weighed down by darkness. Deep down, Darius knew one thing. From the second he chose to catch Victoria, he had stepped into the heart of the storm. But it would be from that very storm's center that the truth would soon erupt, and no one in that room would be ready for what followed. The banquet hall grew increasingly chaotic, as Victoria slumped on the lounge chair, her head drooping, still mumbling half-conscious words. The young employees, having just watched her collapse and be caught by Darius, now buzzed even louder. Their stares, both amused and scornful, locked onto him, as if waiting for something more entertaining to laugh at. The event manager, his face flushed, and his voice slurred from too much wine, stepped forward and barked loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Who's taking her home? What, you all just gonna stand there and stare?" The shout briefly silenced the room, but when the question hung in the air, no one answered. The same employees who had been loudly mocking her now kept their eyes down, pretending to be busy with drinks, or turning away as if they hadn't heard. Everyone understood that escorting the boss in this state meant trouble, and no one was willing to risk their image or career to do it. A heavy silence settled over the room until a shrill voice rang out from a corner table. "Let that guy drive her. Cheap cars are good for something." The words hit the air like a knife, and every gaze immediately shifted to Darius. He froze for a second, eyes darkening as he saw the staffer pointing directly at him. It wasn't a suggestion, but an order masked in mockery, a way to dump the responsibility on the person they respected least to save themselves. Lena flinched, her wide eyes looking up at her father, and in that worried gaze, she understood they didn't see her dad as a person, just a tool to be used. Darius clenched his jaw, feeling the blood rush to his temples. He didn't want to say yes, but the image of Victoria stumbling flashed back, weighing on his conscience. No matter how arrogant she might be, leaving someone in that vulnerable state was something he couldn't bring himself to do. He looked at his daughter, saw how tightly she stayed beside him, her small hand trembling but still holding on. Her eyes asked the question, "Are you sure, Dad?" But the words didn't come out. Finally, Darius gave a slow but firm nod. Not because of their pressure, not because of their contempt, but because he couldn't walk away from what he knew was right. The room erupted in laughter. One voice sneered, "Yeah, that fits. Guys like him are only good for free rides." Another chimed in, Perfect. Let our poor little hero drive the princess back to her castle in his rusty car. The wave of laughter surged. Each burst a blow to Darius's pride. He didn't respond. He simply looked down at his daughter and said quietly, "Let's go, Lena." His voice was strangely calm, every word tightly held back from breaking into fury. Father and daughter stepped out of the banquet hall under a swarm of stares. Darius's tall frame and Lena's small figure merged into one contrast, making the image even more striking. The black man walked through the sharp, blatant laughter, without lowering his shoulders. The door swung open, closing behind them the music and voices, leaving only the cold night breeze threading through the empty corridor. Lena walked silently beside her father, her small footsteps following his long strides, her tiny hand never letting go of his rough, calloused one. Out in the parking lot, yellow lights cast a glow over rows of sleek luxury cars belonging to upper-level staff, each one gleaming like a symbol of power and status. Among them, Darius's old sedan looked completely out of place, its paint faded, its surface marked with scratches. Lena looked at it, then around the lot, and her eyes dimmed. She had never felt ashamed of the car before, but tonight, when it became the subject of mockery, something stung inside her. Darius opened the car door for her, his movements slow but firm, as if to declare that no one could take away the peace they found in this small space of their own. When he turned around, he saw a few co-workers, still lingering at the hall's entrance, peeking out while smoking and smirking. One of them whistled and called out, dragging the words, "Drive safe, hero. Don't drop your prize on the way." Harsh laughter burst out with clouds of cigarette smoke. Darius stared straight at them, didn't say a word, his eyes cold and still like a frozen lake. For a brief second, the men faltered, then laughed even louder to cover the crack in their bravado. He turned back and opened the driver's door, his eyes briefly meeting Lena's. She was still silent, gripping her backpack tightly, as if trying to hold onto something steady. Darius gave a slight nod, a silent promise that he would protect her no matter what they were facing. Inside him, their contempt was like fuel to a fire, but the fire didn't consume him, it only hardened his resolve. He knew that tonight wasn't just about driving a drunk woman home, it was a test of his endurance as a single father. The car door shut with a metallic thud that echoed through the lot like a marker in time. Inside the vehicle, Lena exhaled, trying to steady herself after everything that had just happened. Darius placed his hand on the steering wheel and took a deep breath. He knew what lay ahead wasn't just the road to Victoria's home, it was a rough stretch where every stare, every word would haunt them like a shadow. He turned to his daughter and said softly, "Sit tight, everything's going to be okay." Lena nodded, her bright eyes reflecting pure trust in her father. And as the engine started, the sedan's faint rumble slipped into the night, marking the beginning of a journey none of the three could have predicted. The road leading out of the city center toward Victoria's apartment complex was pitch dark, the sparse streetlights casting pale yellow light onto pavement still wet with night dew. The worn engine of Darius's sedan hummed steadily, sounding tired in the quiet flow of late-night traffic. Lena sat silently in her seat, clutching her backpack to her chest, eyes anxious as she stared out the window. In the back seat, Victoria leaned to one side, her head resting against the window, occasionally releasing heavy breaths. The stench of alcohol thick in the car. Darius kept both hands firmly on the wheel, eyes fixed ahead, silently hoping this drive would go by without incident. But he knew that peace, in his life, was rare and always fragile. As the car turned onto a wide street near a checkpoint, a flashlight beam suddenly swept across the windshield, followed by a sharp whistle. A police cruiser had pulled sideways across the road, and two uniformed officers approached with deliberately heavy steps. Darius slowly brought the car to a stop, his heart pounding at the thought of what could go wrong. Lena held her breath, her small hands gripping her backpack tightly, eyes locked on the figures outside. The police car door opened, and a tall officer stepped forward, shining his flashlight directly into Darius's face. With a mocking tone, he asked, "Driving around with a drunk woman this late? Looking to score something?" Darius swallowed hard, forcing calm into his voice. "She's my supervisor. I'm taking her home after a company party. My daughter is also in the car, as you can see." He tilted his head slightly, revealing Lena in the beam of light, hoping her presence might lower their suspicion. But instead of understanding, the officer burst out laughing, his voice echoing through the still night. He turned to his partner and said, "You hear that? Sounds like a movie plot. Figures. These black guys are always trying to take advantage of drunk white women." His partner laughed too, a dry, rasping sound that sucked the air from the car. Lena shrank back, covering her face, her small shoulders trembling. Darius felt heat rising to his face, but he clenched his jaw. He knew even one wrong move, one word said too sharply, would escalate everything. The officer leaned closer, flashlight glaring into Darius's eyes, its harsh white light blurring his vision. "You said you're taking your boss home. Let me see some proof." Darius quietly reached into his wallet and handed over his employee badge. The officer glanced at it and smirked. Fake IDs are easy to make. This guy's definitely up to something. The second officer came closer, swinging his flashlight casually, then suddenly slammed it down on the car's hood. The metal rang out sharply in the night, and Lena broke into sobs, wrapping her arms around her knees. "You so much as mouth off. I'll drag you in right now," he growled, his eyes gleaming with threat. Darius took a deep breath, his grip on the steering wheel tightening until his knuckles turned white. He turned his head slightly toward Lena and gave her a small nod, as if to reassure her that her father still had control of the situation. In that moment, Darius saw injustice as clearly as if it were a thick fog settling all around him. He was a single father, simply doing the decent thing, making sure a drunk woman got home safely. Yet to those with power, he was still nothing more than a target for humiliation. The officer sneered. "You're lucky that little girl's in the car. Otherwise, you'd be face down on the pavement by now." He turned the flashlight onto Lena's face. She flinched, her eyes wide with fear, like a small animal backed into a corner. Darius swallowed his anger, speaking in a low, controlled voice. "I just want to get her home safely. That's all. If you want, you can follow us to make sure." The officer stared at him for a long moment, then scoffed. "Follow you? I've got better things to do." "Fine. Go. But don't forget, I don't trust people like you." He swept the flashlight around the car one last time, lingering on Victoria's pale, unconscious face in the back seat, then turned away. His partner gave one more hit to the front of the car before stepping back, leaving a faint dent. "Drive safe, Black Hero," he said, voice soaked in mockery. Darius slowly pressed the gas, the car shuddering as it rolled past the slick patch lit by the police cruiser's blue glow. In the rearview mirror, he still saw the two officers standing there, arms crossed, their cruel smiles unmoving. The air inside the car was heavy. Lena turned to her father, her voice trembling. "They really hate us, don't they?" Darius didn't answer right away. He looked at her, then said softly, "What matters is we're still here, together." He reached over and took her hand. The warmth passed between them, and Lena stopped shaking. The night was still long, and Darius knew more humiliation was waiting down the road. But he also knew that every time they endured, he and his daughter grew stronger. The sedan rolled on, leaving behind the harsh lights of the police car, slipping into the narrow darkness of the road that led toward the apartment complex. Inside Darius, the anger and shame still burned, but beside him, the small warmth of Lena's hand was the only reason he stayed steady on the path, no matter how full of shadows and contempt it might be. The old sedan crawled down the paved road leading to the upscale apartment complex. On both sides, rows of tall trees stood in perfect order, the yellow streetlights casting evenly spaced pools of light, separating this place entirely from the chaos outside. Ahead stood a towering iron gate, rising like an invisible wall dividing the privileged world from everyone else. The reflective glass of the guard booth glared under the lights, and as Darius brought the car to a stop, a heavy-set security guard stepped out, his pale face tense with suspicion, eyes wide like he'd just spotted a criminal. "Stolen car?" he barked, walking up with his flashlight and tapping it hard against the window. Lena flinched, clutching her backpack tightly, her eyes wide with fear. Darius lowered the window, keeping his voice calm. "I work for Hale and Partners. This is our director. I'm driving her home after the company party." He pulled out his company ID from his wallet and held it up to the light. The guard glanced at it, then let out a slow, mocking laugh, the kind meant to crush whatever pride the other person had left. "Working at a big firm and still driving this wreck? Rolling your boss home in this junk, what a joke." He said it loud, letting his words echo through the still air, as if hoping the residents up in the towers could hear too. The insult stabbed straight through Darius, but he showed no reaction. He met the guard's eyes with a calm, cold stare. Lena shrank back, her small hands gripping the backpack until her knuckles turned white. To her, the gate ahead looked like a wall guarding the simplest dream, being allowed into a place the world had decided they didn't belong. The guard jerked his chin toward the back seat, where Victoria lay slumped to one side, her messy hair covering half her face. "She's out cold, and you expect me to believe she's your boss? Got any proof?" His voice was lazy, but laced with icy contempt. Darius took a breath and handed over his ID along with his company card. The guard inspected them for a while, then squinted at Darius. "A guy like you probably just cleans floors there. Don't think for a second you belong higher than that." A sharp gagging sound from the back cut through the air. Victoria suddenly lurched forward and vomited on the floor of the car, the stench of alcohol and bile filling the space. The guard jumped, leaned in, and finally saw her familiar face beneath the tangled hair. He froze, his mocking grin faltering into awkward recognition. Clearing his throat, he stepped back and signaled to his coworker to open the gate. "All right, go in. Just don't linger here." The heavy iron gate creaked open, the grinding sound echoing through the night like some reluctant machine making way for someone who didn't belong. Darius slowly drove forward, catching in the rearview mirror the guard still watching. His expression stuck between contempt and resentment. Darius said nothing. He pressed the gas and left behind the final clang of the gate closing shut. Inside the car, Lena still clutched her backpack, eyes fixed on the towering buildings rising around them, their luxury lights glowing brightly behind spotless glass. She asked quietly, her voice tight, "Dad, why do they always treat us like we're thieves?" Darius didn't answer right away. He drove slowly along the polished stone road, passing neatly trimmed trees and rows of luxury cars parked with precision, all of it flaunting a world he and his daughter were only allowed to observe from the outside. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but firm. "Because they think power gives them the right to decide who belongs and who doesn't, but we don't live to please them." Lena looked at her father, her eyes wet but filled with trust. The sedan moved deeper into the complex, its tires rolling over the stone path, the sound echoing through the quiet space. Darius knew this night was only the beginning of the test, but his daughter's gaze reminded him of one thing. No matter how many insults came, he would keep going for Lena and for the kindness he believed had to be protected. Then he pulled up to the front of the building where Victoria lived, bracing himself for the next stretch, where the challenges would be even harder than the gate that had just closed behind them. The high-rise lobby was silent, with only the steady sound of Darius's footsteps echoing as he helped Victoria from the car into the building. The woman who once walked with such pride now hung heavily against his arm, her body limp. Lena walked quietly behind them, her wide eyes taking in the luxurious space. Deep red carpets stretched endlessly, paintings glittered under the chandelier light, everything unfamiliar and grand, like another world. But even in that elegance, the silence made their steps loud, underscoring the out-of-place presence of a single father and his little girl. Darius unlocked the apartment door, with the key the manager had given him. Inside, the air carried the scent of expensive perfume mixed with leftover wine from past parties. He led Victoria in, and gently lowered her onto a large leather sofa in the living room. Her body slumped back, hair falling loose, face flushed red from alcohol. Darius straightened, scanning the room before exhaling, ready to leave. All he wanted now was to step out of that stifling space, knowing that every extra second inside could be twisted into another weapon for people to use against him. But just as he turned to go, a faint sound stopped him. Victoria's voice, broken and slurred, slipped into the silence. "I'm tired of pretending to be proud. I'm just scared." Darius froze, his eyes shifting to the woman lying there, lips still moving softly, words tangled with shallow breaths. What she said didn't sound like it was meant to be heard, more like a piece of a cracked soul slipping out mid-drunken haze, a confession even she wasn't aware of making. He stood still, overcome by a feeling hard to name. This was the same woman who had once embodied power, whose presence in the office had made people lower their eyes. He remembered her sharp judgments, the cold glances she'd cast at employees, including him. But now, in front of him, wasn't that commanding figure, only a person worn down from carrying the weight of being untouchable. For the first time, Darius saw something in her that reflected himself, a person who had spent years pretending to be strong, just to stay standing in front of their child. Lena sat close beside her father, her small hand gently gripping the hem of his shirt. She looked up at his face, then over at Victoria, and collapsed on the sofa. "Dad," she whispered, voice barely above breath, "is she like us?" The question struck Darius in the heart. He turned to her, and in those dark eyes, he saw innocence mixed with a painful kind of maturity that a child should never carry. He leaned down, placing his large hand gently on her shoulder, and nodded without saying a word. In that moment, he knew explanations would fall short. Only silence and presence could protect the peace his daughter still held onto. In that moment, Darius felt the full weight of the conflict within himself. On one hand, he pitied Victoria, seeing clearly that behind the mask of power was a soul worn down by exhaustion. On the other hand, he couldn't ignore the part she played in the injustices at the company, where men like him were pushed aside and treated with contempt. He stood between those two extremes, unsure which side to lean toward, knowing only that he didn't want to become someone numb to others. He had learned to grit his teeth and endure for the sake of his daughter, and now he couldn't bring himself to walk away while someone else was being crushed by the same mask of pretense. The apartment was so quiet that the ticking of the wall clock sounded loud and sharp. Lena leaned her head against her father's arm and whispered, "I didn't think she'd say that. I thought she was always strong." Darius gently brushed her hair, his eyes still fixed on Victoria. "Sometimes, Lena, the ones who seem the strongest are the ones who are the most tired. They're afraid of letting others see what's really inside." Lena stayed silent, staring at the woman on the couch, her young heart caught between suspicion and sympathy. Victoria shifted slightly, her lips murmuring disjointed words like shards falling from a cracked vase. Darius heard the word "afraid" repeated over and over, mixed with fragmented sounds that never fully form. He realized then that behind her coldness and arrogance was a woman haunted by fears no one else might ever guess. And in that moment, he understood that power didn't make anyone invincible. It only built a mask to cover the deepest wounds. He sat down next to Lena, thinking how the ones looked down on and the ones in power might not be so different after all. One wore pride to survive a world built on pressure. The other wore strength to endure a world waiting to humiliate. Two sides that seemed opposite had something deeply in common: fear. Darius stood slowly, went to the kitchen, and poured a glass of water, placing it on the table near where Victoria lay. He wasn't sure she would wake to drink it, but it was something he could do. Lena watched him, her eyes glowing with quiet admiration. In that moment, she understood that kindness wasn't something handed out, it was a choice made, no matter the circumstances. Outside the wide glass window, the city still glowed, traffic sounds echoing faintly in the distance, a stark contrast to the stillness inside. Darius knew that by morning, rumors and judgment would close in tighter, but for now, after hearing the truth slip out of the most powerful woman in the company, he felt he had crossed a different kind of line, not one defined by class or skin color, but the one between pretending and truth. And for the first time in a long night, he felt strangely unburdened, as if, finally, he was no longer alone. Morning sunlight streamed through the large glass window, flooding the high-rise apartment and lighting up every elegant corner. Victoria stirred, her head buzzing like hundreds of tiny hammers pounding at once. Each breath dragged with it the bitter aftertaste of last night's liquor. She opened her eyes slowly and realized she was lying on the living room sofa, her dress wrinkled, her high heels tossed aside on the floor. Fractured memories rushed in, chaotic, yet painfully clear. Beside the glass coffee table sat a full glass of water and a neatly folded note. Victoria reached out with a trembling hand and picked it up. The handwriting was precise. "Got you home safe, Darius." She blinked, fingers tightening around the note, breath catching in her throat. The employee she had never regarded as an equal, the man ignored by nearly everyone at the company, was the one who had helped her through her drunken collapse. Shame flooded her, coloring her pale cheeks with a deep flush. Victoria closed her eyes, the humiliation burning in her chest. She remembered stumbling, the sound of breaking glass, the mocking eyes of her staff, and the steady grip of Darius's arm keeping her from falling. It all came back like a blade cutting through the armor she had worn so long. To them, the woman once called the Ice Queen had become a joke, and worse, one rescued by the very man they all disrespected. A sudden vibration from the phone on the table broke her thoughts. She reached for it, unlocked the screen, and froze at the flood of messages pouring in. A colleague had sent a blurry photo from the party hall, showing Darius carrying her out, lights flashing, surrounded by sneering faces. The caption read, "Everyone's talking. You've seen it, right? Your driver's the office legend now." Her hands shook, the phone nearly slipping from her grip. More messages followed. "Are you okay? I heard. Is it true? That guy took you all the way home? God, you got carried out in front of everyone." Each message landed like a hammer, smashing what pride she had left. She opened the company's group chat, her heart sinking at the flood of gossip. Someone had typed, "Boss Hale fell asleep on the black driver's shoulder. Unbelievable." Another added, "Guess she found herself a new kind of distraction." A mocking emoji followed, triggering a string of sarcastic reactions. Victoria collapsed back onto the sofa, heart pounding. Just hours ago, she had been a symbol of authority. Now, it was all in ruins under the weight of jeering messages. She bit her lip, the taste of blood rising in her mouth, eyes stinging with shame. Her drunken words echoed faintly in her mind, that confession she had never meant anyone to hear. "I'm tired of pretending to be proud. I'm just scared." If Darius had heard it, if he understood, then the humiliation was even worse. Outside the glass window, the city was waking up with the sound of traffic and lines of people rushing to work. But inside the apartment, the air was thick, and each buzz from the phone tore another piece from Victoria's pride. She exhaled and picked up the note Darius had left, her vision blurring as she read each word again. Part of her felt ashamed that she had allowed an employee to witness her collapse, but another part couldn't ignore the strange feeling stirred by the simple kindness in that note, as if, for the first time, someone had seen her as a person, not just a seat of power. One question circled endlessly in her mind: what will happen when I walk into the company today? The image of mocking eyes and constant whispers haunted her. She imagined herself walking down the hallway where the sound of her heels once silenced conversations, now echoing through snickering and smirks. The shame made her want to disappear, but she knew she couldn't. Work, reputation, position, everything demanded that she face it. She stood up, went to the bathroom, turned on the cold water, and splashed her face repeatedly. The icy stream brought clarity to her mind, but it didn't erase the sting behind her eyes. Staring into the mirror, she saw a tired face, dark circles under her eyes, and pale lips. For the first time in years, Victoria didn't recognize the woman looking back. The reflection wasn't the powerful image she had carefully crafted, but someone who had just fallen from grace in front of an entire office. Meanwhile, in another corner of the city, Darius had brought Lena back to their small apartment and was getting ready for another ordinary day. He didn't yet know about the messages and images spreading across the company. He had no idea that his simple act had become the center of a storm. But Victoria, sitting alone in her luxury apartment, knew this morning would be anything but normal. It was the morning that marked a turning point, the collapse of the image she had spent years building, and the rise of a man she had never thought twice about, now becoming the name on everyone's lips. She sat back down, head in her hands, the phone still buzzing nonstop. The rumors were out of control, and there was no way to block them. Fear rose inside her, no longer just for her reputation, but for a deeper sense that something irreversible was beginning. And this time, Victoria knew she could no longer hide behind her pride. The employee break room that morning was nothing like usual. Instead of the soft hum of the coffee machine and scattered small talk, the place buzzed like a crowded market. Staff clustered in groups, eyes glued to their phones, passing around blurry photos that were still clear enough to recognize. A black man carrying a woman in an expensive business dress through the banquet hall. Whispers spread like wildfire, mixing with bursts of laughter. A young woman covered her mouth theatrically, but her voice was loud enough for all to hear. Looks like Boss Hale slept with the black driver. The group erupted, their laughter spilling outward like oil spreading across water. Eyes lit up with curiosity, hungry to witness the downfall of someone who had always stood above them. In the corner, a contract security guard chimed in, his shrill voice cutting through the chatter. This company really is going downhill. Low-class guys climbing their way up. Guess the boss found herself a new toy. He threw his head back and laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. A few others nodded along, adding their own mocking remarks. In that cramped space, every rumor added fuel to the fire, turning the room into a cauldron of contempt and ridicule. The door swung open, and Darius stepped in, holding his old ceramic mug to grab some coffee before starting work. He heard everything. Every word hit his ears, hammering into his thoughts. His chest tightened, hand clenching the mug until his knuckles turned white. As he passed the group, he felt their eyes pierce his back like needles, as if he were the morning's entertainment. He said nothing, gave them no satisfaction, but the blood surged in his hand. When the mug filled, he gripped it so hard that a thin red line surfaced across his palm, blood rising just beneath the skin. One male employee nudged another and sneered. See that? He knows the rumor's out. Bet he's planning to make it real now. Laughter erupted again, mixed with the clink of cups and glasses like a twisted melody of smugness. Lena wasn't there to hear it, but Darius knew if his daughter ever did, her young heart would carry one more wound. He swallowed the rage and stared ahead at the coffee machine, refusing to look back. The tension snapped the moment the sharp rhythm of high heels echoed from the hallway. Laughter dimmed, then vanished altogether. Victoria appeared at the doorway, her posture straight, her face frozen in a mask of ice. Her eyes swept the room, each glance slicing across faces like a blade. No one dared to breathe loudly. The ones laughing moments ago dropped their eyes to their screens, pretending to be busy. The security guard cleared his throat, trying to slip away, but Victoria's stare landed on him long enough to make his entire body freeze. In that moment, the room felt heavy, still as a chapel. Only the ticking of the wall clock and faint breathing broke the silence. Darius stood quietly in the corner, coffee cup still warm in his hand, though blood still seeped from where he had gripped too hard. He looked toward Victoria, and saw that her face no longer bore any trace of the previous night. What he saw now was a mask colder than ever. Her eyes, calm on the surface, carried a fierce intensity that everyone in the room could feel. Victoria stepped fully into the room, her heels clicking against the tile floor. She said nothing, but the silence spoke louder than any reprimand. Each of her steps seemed to stamp out another bit of laughter, another whisper still lingering in the air. The atmosphere was so thick it felt like even a blink could make a sound. When she stopped at the center of the room, every head lowered, every gaze turned away. The cold in her eyes alone was enough to freeze the rumors in the throats of those who had spread them. Darius didn't know what Victoria would do next, but he knew one thing. In this moment, her authority remained, though it was now battling a fracture carved deep by rumor. And he also knew this story was no longer confined to whispered jokes in the break room. It would spread like a storm. The air inside the executive office turned dense the moment the door closed behind Darius. Victoria was already seated behind her desk, hair pinned up neatly, her face revealing nothing, but her eyes held a coldness that made it hard to breathe. She didn't bother with pleasantries. Her voice was sharp, each word landing like a blade. What did you do last night? The question was short, but it carried doubt, shame, and anger. Darius stood tall, hands clasped together, eyes steady. He answered in a low, clear tone. I just brought you home. My daughter saw everything. The room fell silent. Victoria leaned back in her chair, eyes locked on him, lips pressed tight, as if restraining something. The image of being carried out of the banquet haunted her, and the rumors swirling through the company made it impossible to stay calm. She gritted her teeth and spoke with weight. "You think that explanation is enough for me to believe you? One night out of control, and my reputation is in the gutter, and you expect me to just accept that?" Darius didn't blink. His heart pounded, but his voice held firm. "I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm telling the truth. Lena was there. She saw everything." At the mention of the child, Victoria faltered. She remembered the little girl standing beside her father in the hall, eyes trembling as the crowd laughed. But that flicker of softness vanished. She straightened, folding her hands on the desk, voice sharpened to a point. "Do you have any idea what's happening out there? They say I passed out on your shoulder. They call me pathetic for leaning on someone beneath me. Do you know what that means?" Darius drew a breath, eyes fixed on her. "I know. And I'm taking the hits too. My daughter's already heard the jokes. But I don't regret bringing you home instead of leaving you to that crowd." Victoria froze. For a beat, silence returned. Then she stood abruptly and walked toward him, her heels tapping evenly on the hardwood floor. She stopped just in front of Darius, eyes like steel, voice low and tense. "You think your kindness makes me grateful? Don't flatter yourself. I don't need pity from anyone, especially not from someone like you." Darius heard every word, each one hitting like a punch to the chest, but he didn't flinch. He replied slowly, each word measured. "I don't pity you. I just couldn't walk away when I saw another human about to fall. That was my choice." Their eyes locked, blades in a space so tight it could barely hold the tension. Victoria saw no fear in Darius, no meekness like in other staff, and none of the smugness she feared, only cold resolve. It unsettled her more than she expected, because it forced her to consider that maybe everything he said was true, but the wound to her pride wouldn't let her accept it. She turned away, voice low and strained. "I'll handle my own mess. Don't expect redemption. And don't expect anyone to thank you." Darius nodded, stepped back, his hand still clenched. Before turning away, he left behind a quiet sentence that echoed in the still room. "I never needed recognition. As long as my daughter knows her father did the right thing, that's enough." The words froze Victoria for a moment, her heart skipping in a way she couldn't explain. The door closed behind Darius, leaving the vast office filled only with the sound of her unsteady breath. The tense confrontation ended with no resolution, only two wounded hearts, each scarred in a different way. But from that moment on, both Darius and Victoria knew the battle ahead wouldn't just be about gossip. It would be about the truth exploding into the open, when no one could deny it anymore. Victoria clenched her jaw, her eyes flashing like they could cut through the distance between her and Darius. Her voice came out low, every word dripping with bitterness. "You think I'm going to believe you? Don't even dream of using this." The sound of her voice cracked through the tension like a whip. Darius stood tall, his gaze unwavering, and his voice dropped into something cold, slicing through the air. "I don't want anything except the truth." In that moment, the entire room felt frozen, locked between two stares, one proud and defiant, the other unshakable like stone. The silence stretched until the space itself seemed to shrink. Victoria felt her heart pounding, but refused to let even a crack show. The shame from the night before was still fresh, and now it was hidden behind a mask of anger. Darius was different. He no longer felt small under the weight of power. After years of being looked down on, he had learned to meet eyes and not flinch beneath contempt. What he had just said wasn't a defense. It was a declaration. He would not let anyone define his life through doubt. Victoria turned away, her hands pressing into the surface of the desk, fingernails leaving marks in the polished wood. She struggled to breathe under the weight of his honesty, because in his eyes, she saw something she didn't possess, a calm that came from holding the truth, even when it gained him nothing. She wanted to push harder, to throw more accusations, but the words caught in her throat. Darius's silence wasn't surrender. It was a force she couldn't overpower. In that moment, the memory of the party surged back, the crowd's laughter, Lena's dark eyes gripping her father's hand, the solid arm that kept her from hitting the cold marble floor. Those fragments, no matter how much she tried to deny them, collided with the doubt she was still clinging to. Victoria bit her lip, but the sting rising in her eyes began to unnerve her. She knew she couldn't let anyone see that flicker of emotion, especially not someone she had always assumed was at the bottom of the social ladder. Darius didn't walk away, nor did he lower his voice. He left the silence hanging because he understood that sometimes silence was stronger than 100 defenses. He thought of Lena, of her face when she heard her classmates mocking, and a storm surged in his chest. But even within that storm, he held on to his outward calm. What he wanted wasn't to win an argument, but to let the truth stand on its own. Finally, Victoria raised her head, her eyes still sharp but now marked with a faint crack. She turned her back to the room, facing the window, watching the steady flow of traffic below. Her voice was quieter, though she still forced it to sound firm. "I won't let one night's mistake destroy everything I've built." Darius watched her in silence, then replied in a voice so low it seemed meant only for her. None of us gets to choose how others see us, but we can choose how we face it. I chose the truth. Those words caught in Victoria's throat. She understood that the truth he spoke wasn't just for her. It was a truth he claimed for himself, and for the child who had walked beside him through the storm of shame. In that rare moment, she saw how thin the line was between them. Both had been pushed into the shadows of judgment, but one had pretended to be untouched, while the other had held firm in what he believed. The tension between them ended not with resolution, but with a small fracture in the layer of ice that once seemed unbreakable. Before the rumors at the company had time to settle, the next morning, a video from the banquet hall's security camera suddenly leaked online. Unlike the blurry photos taken in haste, the footage was crystal clear, capturing every detail. Darius carrying Victoria in his arms, walking through a crowd still buzzing with laughter and stares. The lights from the hall shone directly on them, making the scene appear almost staged. Within hours, the video had spread rapidly, appearing on numerous news sites and forums. The flood of comments came in waves, split into two opposing camps. One side hailed Darius as a silent hero, a brave employee who didn't hesitate to carry his boss out of an embarrassing situation. They wrote heartfelt words like, "He's proof that decency still exists," and "A single father working hard, raising his child, and still acting with integrity truly admirable." But the opposing voices were even louder, bitter in tone. Many typed accusations with icy cynicism. A clear opportunist. He knew the cameras were there, obviously staged it for sympathy. Don't be fooled. Nobody does that without an agenda. Darius had no idea the video was being scrutinized frame by frame. He was busy with daily tasks, trying to keep life normal for Lena, but the news spread too quickly to avoid. At school, a group of kids cornered Lena, shoved a phone in her face, and burst out laughing. "Your dad's famous now," carrying the boss lady like some romance movie. Lena stood frozen, her face flushing with shame. The words pierced her young heart like arrows. That evening, she came home silent, eyes red, unwilling to tell her father anything. That night, hearing soft sighs from his daughter's room, Darius realized the storm had reached their home. He picked up his phone, instantly greeted by dozens of links to the video. Headlines blared across the screen. Scandalous office romance, female boss and black driver, hero or opportunist. His heart clenched, but his expression stayed calm. He turned off the screen, sat in silence for a long moment, then walked to Lena's room, placed a hand on her shoulder, and whispered, "I know you've heard awful things, but only the truth stays with us forever." Lena didn't respond, but nodded gently, hugging him tighter. Across the city, Victoria was also witnessing the explosion of public scrutiny. She sat in her upscale apartment as her phone rang non-stop with calls from board members, media, and old acquaintances. Every voicemail cut deeper into her humiliation. "You should start preparing a statement. You've dragged the company's name through the mud." She stared at the screen, scrolling through thousands of comments under the video, a mix of pity and mockery. Phrases like, "Even the Ice Queen needs a man's arms," and "Power's just a mask," flushed her face with heat. Her hands shook so much that the glass of water on the table tipped over, and she didn't even notice. The rage and humiliation kept Victoria tossing and turning all night. She knew any denial was useless. Security footage didn't lie. The video didn't capture the mocking laughter around her, didn't show Darius being pushed away. It only showed a black man carrying the female executive out of the hall. And so, everyone interpreted it however they pleased. In her mind, a deeper fear crept in. Perhaps even she was starting to lose sight of what was true, and what was the mud being flung by public opinion. The next morning, stepping into the company, Darius immediately sensed something was off. The normally busy hallway felt subdued, and employees whispered as he passed. A few openly turned to stare, smirking without shame. But Darius kept his back straight, his eyes steady. He knew the storm was far from over, and he had to stay grounded, not just for himself, but for his daughter. Because the truth, no matter how many times distorted, would eventually find its way through. At lunch on the schoolyard bench, Lena sat quietly, eyes following her classmates gathered in circles. She wished to be left alone, but that hope vanished when a group of students approached, one holding a phone with the viral video playing. A boy sneered, "Your dad's the boss lady's boy toy." Laughter exploded, echoing across the lively schoolyard. Lena stood frozen, face burning red, throat locked in silence. In those mocking eyes, she felt herself being dragged into a dark pit, where her family's dignity and pride were torn apart by just a few seconds of footage. That entire day, Lena couldn't lift her head in class. Every whisper behind her cut like a blade into her fragile heart. She didn't fully understand all the words being said, but the cruelty in the voices left a mark. After school, she walked out with red, swollen eyes, her backpack heavier, as if loaded with shame. Darius waited by the corner, and the moment he saw her, he knew something was wrong. Lena walked up, tried to smile, her lips trembling, and then broke down, burying her face into his chest. Darius wrapped his arms around her, his large hands covering the small frame that trembled against him. He felt each tear soak into his shirt, his heart clenching with her pain. In his reddened eyes, a fire lit not one of blind anger, but of fierce resolve. He knew his daughter had become an innocent target of vile gossip, and he swore he would not let anyone turn his kindness into a weapon to hurt Lena ever again. The walk home that day was silent, with only the sound of their footsteps echoing along the sidewalk. Lena held her father's hand tightly, still sobbing quietly, while Darius gripped hers even firmer, as if trying to pass on his strength. Inside him, anger mixed with the ache of seeing his daughter hurt turned into resolve. He was used to being looked down on, but watching his innocent child torn apart by cruel words was something else. It pushed him to stand tall, not only to defend the truth but to teach his daughter that no hateful voice could define who they were. When they reached their small apartment, Darius sat beside Lena, his hand still holding hers. He looked into her red, swollen eyes, and spoke with steady conviction. "You have to remember, what they say isn't the truth. They laugh because they're weak, but we'll be stronger because we stand by what's right." Lena nodded slightly, her breath still shaky, but a small light flickered in her eyes. She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling that steady strength wrap around her like a wall holding back the storm. Darius knew this was only the beginning of the rising tide, but he no longer felt fear. His eyes burned with determination, shining with the resolve to protect his daughter and the truth he had chosen. Because in that moment, holding Lena tightly, he understood that his strength didn't come from reputation or status, but from the responsibility of being a father, and from an unshakable belief in decency. On social media platforms, within a single night, the video and a series of images from the party became the center of attention. Thousands of shares brought in waves of opposing comments, and soon, new hashtags emerged. #DrunkBoss spread like wildfire, accompanied by countless memes mocking the image of Victoria slumped over Darius's shoulder. At the same time, #SingleDad gained traction, with many using Darius's story to praise him, while others twisted it to mock. These two conflicting hashtags pulled the entire company into a storm of gossip, turning every employee into either a witness or an accomplice in a collective joke. Darius had never cared much for social media, but he couldn't stop the flood of information. His phone buzzed constantly, friends sent him links, and coworkers looked at him differently, even if they said nothing. When he opened an online article, he saw the top comment with thousands of likes. "They always know how to sneak in through the back door." Below the sentence were laughing emojis and more cruel replies. The account that posted it belonged to a familiar name, the security guard who had stopped his car that night. The words weren't just aimed at him, but were meant to diminish everyone like him, people whom society had already assigned a place at the bottom. Lena sat next to her father, glanced at a few lines, then quickly turned off the screen. She didn't fully understand the venom in those words, but she could feel the bitterness in their tone. Darius looked at her, resting his hand on her small shoulder, and a fire of anger lit inside him. He knew that silence would only let them push further, but he also knew that any emotional reaction would be used as another excuse to tear him down. Meanwhile, at the office, the work atmosphere was swept away by the media storm. Employees typed half-heartedly while sneaking glances at their phones, and every time a new hashtag appeared, the whispers returned. One group passed around articles calling Darius a reluctant hero, while another sent each other satirical posts that turned him into a punchline. The looks he received walking through the hallway were a mix of curiosity, suspicion, and mockery. Victoria sat in an emergency board meeting, her phone lighting up non-stop with new notifications. The board demanded she respond, but she had yet to find a way to face it. Every hashtag, every comment, felt like another knife to the reputation she had worked so hard to build. Worse still, the same people who once bowed their heads to her now mocked her openly. She understood that, in the public eye, power no longer protected her, it only made her downfall more visible. Darius returned to the small apartment and sat by the window, staring out at the street. The sound of traffic blended with the constant pinging of phone alerts, but he no longer checked them. He knew the storm hadn't passed, but he also knew there was no turning back. Holding Lena close at his side, he thought quietly, if those hashtags could shake the truth, then he would live to prove that truth could never be buried. His gaze darkened, but stayed steady, like a small flame smoldering quietly, waiting for the day it would rise into defiant fire. Victoria sat alone in the brightly lit room, but felt no warmth. In front of her, her laptop screen was cluttered with open tabs, each one filled with articles and forum posts about the video. Hashtags scrolled endlessly, memes twisted her image into a joke, and comments reveled in seeing a powerful female executive dragged down from her pedestal. Her face darkened, the lines on her skin more pronounced under the white light, her hand trembling slightly as she moved the mouse and read each mocking word. She had always known her job required a thick skin, but never had humiliation felt so direct. The words didn't just target her image, they pulled down the company and the career she had spent years building. Across the city, Darius had no idea what was unfolding. He had just finished his evening shift and stopped by the neighborhood store to grab essentials for Lena. In his mind, the past few days had been heavy enough, but he believed that if he kept his head down and focused on work, the storm would pass. He couldn't have imagined that the entire city was tearing into his reputation like a piece of raw meat, with everyone feeling entitled to judge. To them, Darius was no longer an ordinary employee, a single father working hard to raise his child, but a symbol to be debated, mocked, praised, or vilified. Victoria leaned back in her chair, shut her eyes, and took a deep breath, but it did nothing to ease the throbbing in her head. She recalled that morning when she walked into the office and everything felt different. Eyes darted away too quickly, conversations halted abruptly as she passed, and even the smiles from once submissive employees were forced. The silence was more terrifying than the rumors it meant everyone knew and was silently judging. Victoria realized she had lost more than just an image. She had lost the fear she once commanded through cold discipline and unwavering authority. Meanwhile, in the small apartment, Darius cared about only one thing: how to help Lena sleep through the night without waking to the sound of cruel laughter echoing from school. He sat by her bed, reading a few pages from a children's book, his voice calm and steady, meant to soothe. Lena kept her eyes closed but held tightly to his arm, as if letting go would cause the world to collapse around her. Darius bent down, kissed the top of her head, and whispered that tomorrow would be better. He didn't know that outside, the venomous comments kept spreading, hundreds more joining the storm with each passing minute. Victoria replayed the video, this time trying to watch every frame closely. She saw herself at her worst, being carried like a burden, her head resting on Darius's shoulder, her cold, composed image completely gone. She pressed her lips together, filled with both anger at herself and resentment toward those who had spread the footage. She thought of the board of directors, of key partners, of each contract that might now waver because of one moment of weakness. The more she thought, the darker her face became, and the shadow in her eyes spread like a cloud blotting out the sky. While Victoria was tormented by the media storm, Darius walked through the city at night with a small bag in hand, unaware. Neighbors greeted him warmly. They hadn't mentioned the rumors, and not everyone followed those online forums. To them, he was still the diligent neighbor, the man who took his daughter to school each morning and came home late every night. He returned their greetings with his usual calm, unaware that his image was being dissected in heated online debates. Back in her upscale apartment, Victoria slammed the laptop shut and walked out to the balcony. The city stretched below, car lights moving like streams of drifting fire. She gripped the railing tightly, a mix of rage and helplessness rising in her chest. The power she once believed was her shield had become the easiest target for public attacks. She whispered to herself, voice breaking, "No one knows what I had to endure to get here." The words vanished into the night air, unheard by anyone, but they revealed the fragile line between admiration and isolation. Darius sat at the small dining table, opening his notebook to carefully record each expense. For him, keeping the household afloat was the biggest concern. He didn't realize that the calm surrounding him was only temporary. The city, the company, even familiar faces, now saw him as a talking point, a label. He had no idea that his silence was being spun into evidence for countless assumptions. And he certainly didn't know that to many, he had become an opportunist or worse, a convenient example to reinforce long-held prejudice. Victoria returned to her desk and sank into the chair. In her mind, Darius's eyes flashed again, eyes that didn't flinch under her authority, eyes that held only calm when speaking about the truth. That image unsettled her, reminding her of the moment during her drunken haze when she confessed how tired she was. Now, while the city buzzed with gossip, only one person had seen her at her most vulnerable, and it was the man she had once looked down on. That realization left her shaken, ashamed, and furious, as though she had been exposed even before anyone truly heard her. Darius turned off the lights in the living room, leaving only the dim hallway glow. He sat in silence for a long while, eyes fixed on the small window. Deep down, he knew more storms were ahead, but he held firm in his choice. His daughter was asleep, and that alone gave him strength. He didn't know that outside, the hashtags continued to explode, and the city kept tearing apart every detail. But in his heart, truth remained the only foundation he could stand on. Two people, at opposite ends of the city, one in a luxury apartment, the other in a rundown flat, were both facing the same shadow. Victoria knew well the weight of whispers, while Darius still walked unknowingly through the storm, without realizing its full force. That distance between them would, sooner or later, lead to another confrontation, where truth would no longer be something to keep private, but either a weapon or a mirror, forcing everyone to see themselves clearly. Tabloids, always thriving on scandal, had found a goldmine. In a single morning, countless online platforms released articles with clickbait headlines like, Single dad seduces his boss. The cover photo captured the moment Darius carried Victoria through the ballroom, the spotlight casting over his tense face and her limp, drunken posture. Not a single article mentioned the chaos in the background, the mocking crowd, or the cruelty he and his daughter endured, only a fabricated affair, as if they had all watched a scripted drama unfold. Readers flooded the comment sections, each word pushing the narrative further from the truth. Some laughed, calling it the classic tale of a man from the bottom clawing his way to the top, while others mocked Victoria, saying power always crumbles before cheap temptation. Amid thousands of comments, voices defending Darius were drowned out, buried under a wave of blind judgment. Reporters showed up in his neighborhood, aiming their cameras at his old car in the lot, his modest apartment window, spinning tales of a schemer rising from poverty. When they knocked on his door, Darius cracked it open, heard their introductions, and quietly closed it again. No explanations, no statements, only silence, his chosen shield against the knives flying outside. The next day, he still carried Lena's backpack on his shoulder, still drove the old sedan through the familiar gates. Security glanced at him coldly, clusters of co-workers whispered, but Darius walked as if he heard none of it. He knew any reaction would be twisted into evidence against him. The only way forward was to keep working, keep living, and let time vindicate the truth. In the office, tabloids were left lying around, screens lit up with articles, eyes subtly shifting toward him. Darius sat at his desk, opened files, and wrote down numbers as though the storm outside didn't exist. His composure made some people uneasy, others annoyed. They were expecting a meltdown, something they could pounce on. At lunch, while the building buzzed with gossip, Darius slipped away to buy Lena a few new books. Standing in the quiet bookstore, flipping pages, he found rare calm. In his daughter's world, he wanted to protect what was still pure, a refuge from the noise. No matter what the city said, in that moment, his only duty was to guard her peace, even if just within the scent of fresh paper. Back home, he found a few tabloids wedged under the door, headlines printed in bold accusation. Darius picked them up, folded them, and dropped them into the trash. His eyes no longer burned with rage, only quiet resolve. He knew his silence might be misread, but he also knew saying more would only feed the fire. And through it all, what mattered most wasn't clearing his name, it was making sure Lena never lost faith that her father stood tall in the storm. The tabloids kept printing new editions, fabricating imagined details to hook readers, but Darius no longer let them touch him. In the darkness of the small apartment, he held his daughter close, eyes shining with quiet resolve. He knew his dignity was being smeared day by day, but he believed the truth couldn't be buried forever, and that belief was the only thing keeping him going. Lena sat curled up on the old wooden chair in their tiny home, her eyes red, tears still spilling even before the last ones had dried. She looked at her father, her voice breaking under the weight of pain long held in, "I don't want to go to school anymore." The childlike words struck Darius deeper than any insult he'd ever endured. He sat down beside her, wrapping his arms around her small frame, listening to her sobs, mixed with shaky breaths. In that moment, he felt all his efforts to protect Lena's peace unravel under the weight of rumor. He didn't know how to explain to a child that truth could never outrun lies, that silence wasn't surrender, but the only way to preserve pride in the eye of a storm. Across the city, Victoria sat quietly in her office, her phone lighting up with constant alerts, but she no longer had the courage to open them. Every clickbait headline, every cruel comment haunted her, making her grip the edge of the desk until her knuckles turned white. She knew her silence only deepened the public's twisted version of the story. Worse still was the image of Darius, bearing the storm in her place, trying to shield his daughter from a tide that never should have touched them. She bit her lip, the metallic taste rising, fueled by both fury at those who smeared them and the guilt of knowing her silence was slowly destroying his honor. Victoria remembered the moment Darius carried her out of the ballroom, the look in his eyes devoid of pride or manipulation, just the instinct of a man who couldn't let someone fall. Yet the public had turned that into a shameful spectacle, and she, instead of speaking up, had chosen to hide. Every time she thought of Lena, a child too young to grasp the world but already facing its cruelty, her throat tightened. Deep down, she knew silence meant complicity, and that truth haunted her more than any rumor. Darius, despite the doubting eyes at work, kept a calm front for his daughter. He went to work on time, took Lena out for walks, cooked simple dinners, and told her old bedtime stories. But in each action, Lena felt the shadow hanging over them. His silence couldn't mask the bitterness, only made her feel his isolation more sharply. At night, when Darius thought she was asleep, Lena lay still, listening to the faint sound of him sighing from the living room. That sound etched itself into her memory, leaving a wound that would not easily fade. In her office, Victoria stepped out onto the balcony and looked down at the crowded street below. She saw clearly a cruel paradox. The people spreading the rumors knew nothing of the truth, yet they held the power to shape how everyone saw Darius. Meanwhile, she, the only one who could stop the storm, had chosen to stay silent to protect her own position. The thought twisted in her gut. She began to understand that the pride she clung to was the very knife slicing away pieces of the dignity of a man who had only ever tried to live with integrity. That night, in two homes divided by wealth and circumstance, two people lay restless. One was a father holding his daughter, trying to shield her in every way he could, while his heart burned with humiliation. The other was a powerful woman gripping the balcony railing, wondering how much longer her silence would be just silence, before it turned into a stain she could never wash away. And in that moment, both felt the same truth. The storm outside was no longer a fleeting rumor, but a battle to decide who would hold on to their humanity in the eyes of the world. The top-floor conference room lit up early, weighed down by a heavy atmosphere, as board members filed into their seats. Thick folders were neatly stacked on the table, with a microphone placed at the center, ready for whoever would speak. This internal meeting was no longer about contracts or business strategy, but about an incident that had pulled the company's reputation into a swirl of scandal. The chairman tapped his gavel lightly, his stern voice filling the room. "We will review all statements and evidence. We can't allow the company to remain at the center of this storm." Darius was seated in the last row, his face calm but his eyes steely, every muscle tense with restraint. He knew he wasn't here to be heard, but to serve as a target for suspicion. Lena wasn't present, but her image stayed sharp in his mind, fueling the strength he needed to sit upright. When the chairman gave the signal, the first witness stepped forward. It was the security guard who had worked the event, broad-shouldered and confident, like a man who had rehearsed his script. He adjusted his tie, then looked straight at the board, his voice clear and deliberate. "I saw him force her. He took advantage while Miss Hale was drunk, deliberately escorting her out without any sign of consent." The testimony was punctuated with assured intonation, sparking murmurs throughout the room. Some board members frowned, others turned toward Darius with doubt in their eyes. The written report painted a grim picture, casting him as the accused. Darius clenched his fists, his nails digging deep into his skin, drawing red marks. He wanted to rise, to object, to lay the truth bare, but he knew his words would be dismissed as excuses. In the eyes of the powerful, his voice had little weight to begin with. He lifted his head toward the board, gaze unwavering, yet chose silence. In that silence boiled anger, but also pride, because he believed only the truth could outlast any lie. Victoria sat at the center of the long table, her eyes icy as she watched the events unfold. She heard every word, recognizing the calculated delivery behind the statement. Her chest tightened, because more than anyone, she knew what had just been said didn't reflect the truth. That night still played clearly in her mind. Her unsteady steps, the strong arm that caught her, Lena's terrified eyes. All of it stood in stark contrast to the narrative the guard had just constructed. One board member frowned and asked, "Do you have any evidence for your claim?" The guard smirked. "I witnessed it firsthand. The truth is right here. The cameras only caught part of it. I saw everything." His words landed like a blade, meant to fill the gaps the footage couldn't cover. The boardroom buzzed with uncertainty, eyes not yet aligned but clearly swayed. Darius closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath to stay calm. He knew everything was working against him, knew he could lose everything over a single lie. But when he opened his eyes, his gaze shifted to Victoria, whose face briefly faltered before quickly hiding it. Darius understood that in this room, at least one person held the key to the truth, and he silently hoped that when the time came, that person wouldn't stay silent again. The hearing continued, each word and glance tightening around Darius like a vice. But in his eyes, the fire still burned, quiet and unwavering. He knew the truth wouldn't be extinguished, only waiting for its moment to surface, and when it did, every lie would be exposed for what it was. Darius sat motionless, eyes fixed straight ahead, his face revealing no reaction. Deep down, he knew that any defense now would only give them more to attack. He had lived through too many situations like this, where truth was twisted into a weapon, where his voice never carried weight against prejudice. Silence had become his only choice, both to preserve a shred of dignity and to prove he didn't need to argue to stand by what was right. Yet behind that calm exterior was a storm of rage, surging in his chest, his hands clenched so tightly they went numb. The room fell silent for a few brief seconds, though the weight in the air made them stretch endlessly. All eyes landed on him, not waiting for the truth, but watching to see if he would stumble into the trap just laid. Some board members scribbled notes, others shook their heads in disapproval, as if a verdict had already been made. The scratching of pens against paper only deepened the suffocating atmosphere. In that moment, Darius felt like he was being weighed on a scale by people who had never considered him an equal. At the center of the table, Claudia, the board's rare female member, quietly observed. She hadn't spoken since the session began, simply taking notes, but as she listened to the false testimony and watched Darius's patient silence, something shifted in her eyes. Claudia looked up, staring at the man at the end of the table. In her gaze was not just doubt, but a flicker of indignation. Her hand slowly clenched, as if restraining something rising inside her. The image of Darius, sitting quietly, broad shoulders, carrying the weight of suppressed tension, brought back memories for Claudia of her early years, when she too had been forced into silence in the face of injustice. The memory tightened her chest, because she knew well what it felt like to be voiceless. Her fingers clenched harder, trembling slightly, a reflex against the scene unfolding in front of her. Up front, the security guard who had made the accusation still stood there, eyes full of confidence, like someone certain he held the winning hand. He glanced around the room, stopping at Darius, the corners of his mouth curling into a smug smile. In his mind, Darius's silence was the perfect proof to reinforce his lie. But in Darius's unflinching stare, there was something that unsettled him, a calm that didn't belong to a man cornered. Claudia jotted a few more lines in her notebook, but her eyes never left Darius. His silence wasn't weakness. It felt like a solid wall, making her realize that if anything was truly under attack here, it was the truth itself being suffocated. The sense of injustice in her chest grew stronger by the second, pushing her to the edge of action. And in that moment, her clenched hand was no longer just a way to contain emotion, but the signal of a decision starting to take shape. Darius still said nothing, his eyes lit with a steady, unwavering gaze. He knew the people in this room would likely choose to believe what was easier, rather than what was true. But he also believed silence could sometimes allow the truth to speak on its own. And Claudia, watching the man caught in a circle of judgment, felt her tightened grip become the beginning of a shift, a crucial piece that could tilt the scale away from lies. The heavy silence blanketed the meeting room like a thick fog, every eye fixed on Darius, who sat motionless. Just as the tension stretched to its breaking point, the sound of a chair scraping against the floor broke the stillness. Claudia, who had remained composed since the beginning, slowly stood up. She adjusted her glasses, took a deep breath, and spoke with a firm voice that cut through the wall of suspicion surrounding them. "I can confirm, only Darius brought me home safely." Her words echoed like a bell cracking the suffocating air, turning all the doubtful gazes sharply toward her. The entire room stirred, pens dropped onto desks, and a few gasps escaped in disbelief. At the far end of the table, the security guard froze, his face paling, the smug grin from earlier vanishing in an instant. Board members exchanged looks, their eyes revealing surprise and confusion. They were used to Claudia being cautious, rarely letting emotion into business. But today, she had stepped forward, breaking formation, publicly standing up for an employee long seen as an outsider. Darius lifted his head, his eyes briefly flickering with emotion. He hadn't expected anyone in the room to have the courage to speak up. For so long, he had accepted that he would face the accusations alone, but Claudia's unwavering voice touched a quiet space deep within him. He said nothing, but his eyes lit with a flash of gratitude. The chairman of the board paused, his hand tightening around the small gavel, then said sharply, "Claudia, do you understand that what you just said changes everything?" Claudia didn't back down. Her eyes swept the room with steady resolve. "I understand completely, and I also understand the cost of silence. I saw it with my own eyes. Darius did one thing, he helped that woman get home. There was no force, no hidden motive." Her clear statement cut clean through the tangled web of lies. The room buzzed again, no longer with mocking whispers, but with murmurs of unease. Some board members bent over their files, others leaned in, whispering urgently. The security guard was sweating now, his face drained of color, eyes darting for a way out. In that instant, he understood that the story he had crafted was starting to collapse, and worse, that the truth had come from someone with undeniable authority. Victoria sat at the head of the table, her icy gaze finally flickering. She hadn't expected Claudia to break the silence now. Inside her, a storm of mixed emotions rose, relief that someone was finally defending Darius, and bitterness at herself for not having the courage to do it first. She glanced at Darius, saw him still sitting upright, his gaze steady, and suddenly, she realized that quiet resolve had already forced many to reconsider, including herself. Darius remained still, but inside his chest, his heart pounded like a drumbeat. He didn't need praise, nor did he expect anyone to defend him, but the moment the truth was spoken aloud, it felt like a layer of fog had been torn apart. He knew he wasn't out of danger, but at least now, he was no longer alone. The truth had found a voice, and once spoken, it would be difficult to silence again. The meeting room, once suffocating, now felt like an arena, where gazes clashed rapidly, where the man who fabricated the story began to show signs of panic, and where those still hesitant started to question their own conscience. The truth didn't just shake the board, it opened a door to things that had never been said. And in that moment, Darius understood the storm was only beginning, but this time, he had an unexpected ally. Darius sat in silence for a long moment after Claudia's firm declaration, his heart beating with a new rhythm, no longer crushed beneath the weight of suspicion. The room buzzed, but he didn't care. Deep inside, he felt a new surge of strength. For the first time in days of enduring humiliation, he lifted his head, his eyes burning with pride like a flame reignited. That gaze no longer avoided or feared, but was resolute and strong, reflecting a belief that his dignity remained intact, despite the crushing weight of accusation. Those sitting across from him shifted uncomfortably, no longer seeing a lone employee with his head down, but a man standing firm in the storm. In the last row, Naomi, the only colleague who had ever silently shown him a hint of kindness, gently wiped her eyes. She hadn't said a word since the session began, only watched and listened. But when she saw him lift his head, eyes lit with pride, emotion surged so strongly that tears escaped. A soft smile formed on her lips, trembling yet full of belief, as if to say someone finally saw him for who he truly was. In that moment, Naomi's tearful smile became proof that Darius's resolve had not been in vain. The atmosphere in the room began to shift. The tense silence gave way to uncertain glances. Some lowered their heads to scribble notes, hiding their surprise, and others leaned in to whisper with colleagues. The security guard, once so confident in his accusation, had gone pale, his eyes darting around, looking for something to hold on to. The chairman furrowed his brow, feeling his authority challenged by what had just unfolded. No one could deny the weight of Claudia's words, but what truly unsettled the room was the sight of Darius lifting his gaze. Victoria sat at the head of the table, watching the entire scene, and inside her stirred a strange wave of emotion. She saw that look in his eyes and realized it was nothing like the resigned endurance she'd grown used to. It held the strength of a father defending his child, the strength of someone who'd learned to live in darkness but refused to be swallowed by it. That image made her instinctively pull back in thought, as it reflected a truth she hadn't wanted to face, that she, too, had hidden behind the armor of power to conceal her own vulnerability. Naomi lowered her head, tears streaming down her face, but the smile remained a smile both shy and proud. She remembered all the times she saw Darius quietly working overtime, remembered the moments he brought his daughter to the office, his eyes full of tenderness. All of it came together into an unshakable belief. This man had never needed to take advantage of anyone. He simply chose to be kind, even when it cost him dearly. Now, as the truth slowly emerged, she no longer felt alone in that belief, and her tearful smile was a silent acknowledgement that her faith in him had not been in vain. Darius took a deep breath, steadying himself, letting that proud gaze send a message. He was no longer afraid of judgment. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to prove anything, because the truth was on his side. The pride in his eyes softened the lies spoken earlier, like a light cutting through a room darkened by scheming and prejudice. That feeling forced everyone who witnessed it to confront the truth, whether they wanted to or not. In that moment, two people, a man lifting his head high, and a woman smiling through tears unintentionally became each other's anchor. One proved that dignity could not be crushed forever. The other proved that trust still existed in a world full of doubt. The company board, which had believed it would silence any resistance with a few accusations, now faced an undeniable reality. The truth had surfaced, and it could no longer be buried. From that point on, the atmosphere in the meeting room no longer revolved around fabrication, but around that burning gaze and that tearful smile. Darius and Naomi, through their quiet but powerful presence, forced the board to reconsider. And in that moment, the story was no longer just an internal investigation, but a testament that human dignity could still stand tall, even when battered by storms. After the turbulent hearing, the company board was forced to agree on expanding the scope of the investigation. Initially, the goal was simply to contain reputational damage, but the deeper they dug, the more the pieces formed a much darker picture. Personnel files, security shift logs, and internal reports revealed an unusual pattern. The security officers present at the party and involved in the testimony against Darius were not new to controversial incidents. They were recurring names in outsourced security contracts, and in every case involving internal trouble, they conveniently appeared to provide supportive witness statements. Collected documents revealed that this group had been receiving cash payments through various channels, from security firms to intermediary partners. The amounts weren't large enough to raise alarms but were consistent and discreet, just enough to keep those willing to bend the truth in line. In cases of workplace accidents, internal altercations, or employee disputes, these men helped bury the facts with fabricated reports. The wording was always precise, turning victims into instigators, turning company misconduct into isolated mistakes. The more files were unearthed, the clearer the pattern became. A covert system had been operating for years, so seamlessly that many in the company had come to see it as normal. Internal memos showed multiple instances where leadership remained silent, looking the other way for the sake of convenience. Rather than confront problems, they chose to clean up with fabricated statements, and security officers became their most useful tools. The revelations not only shook the board but left many regular employees stunned. They began connecting memories once dismissed as minor. Coworkers suddenly fired, incidents quietly erased from records, rumors no one dared verify. Now, all of it re-emerged as evidence of a truth that had been deliberately buried. In that web, Darius being cast as a suspect no longer seemed surprising. He was simply the latest link in a long chain of people used to keep the power machine running smoothly. But this time was different. Too many eyes were watching, the public outrage was swelling, and the old playbook could no longer run unchecked. As one link was pulled into the light, the entire dirty network began to tremble. Victoria read every new report with a mix of fury and bitterness. She had believed herself to be the one steering the system, only to realize she had also been a pawn within it. The people she once thought loyal to the company were, in fact, loyal only to the money, willing to write whatever was needed to protect the brand's image. The sting of betrayal kept her frozen for hours in front of the files, her hands unconsciously clenching, as if she could shred the truth from the pages. For Darius, this truth was both painful and liberating. He knew he wasn't the only victim, that what he and his daughter had endured was only a small part of a much longer chain of injustice. But that realization made him stronger, because now he wasn't just fighting for himself, but for everyone who had ever been buried under lies. The exposure of the dirty network was living proof that he had been right to choose silence to preserve his dignity, because in the end, the truth would find its way out. The investigation wasn't over, but even with what had surfaced, trust within the company had been shaken to the core. Faces that once held high now, down. Names once respected were now whispered with disdain. More importantly, the corrupt web that had once covered every corner had been dragged into the light, revealing that power could not protect lies forever. Claudia sat still before the pile of documents just released, filled with numbers, notes, and reports riddled with deception. She had once believed she understood everything happening in the company, that her role on the board was to uphold transparency. But the truth laid bare left her shaken. The pages were like mirrors, reflecting the false face of an entire system, where truth had been pushed aside for schemes and profit. Claudia suddenly muttered, her voice cracking as if admitting her own helplessness. "I was surrounded by lies." The words echoed through the quiet room, making those present pause. It wasn't just a lament, but an admission that even people with power and conscience had allowed themselves to be pulled into the spiral. Darius sat across from her, his face holding its rare calm, his eyes deep and unwavering. He looked straight at Claudia, not surprised, his voice steady but sharp, like a blade cutting to the bone. "This is the price of silence." The sentence dropped like a stone. Claudia froze, her hand trembling slightly on the table, not from fear, but from realizing she had just heard the barest truth. All this time, she had chosen silence when noticing irregularities, had looked away to preserve her position and safety. But now that silence had revealed its true form, not wisdom, but complicity, her mind flashed back to past meetings, where reports were read smoothly, where promises were made to reassure, and she had nodded them through, thinking everything was under control. Now, every puzzle piece connected into a full picture. Silence to keep stability, silence to maintain status, silence to avoid trouble, and in the end, it was that very silence that had nurtured the dirty network. Darius looked at her, not with resentment, but with the reflection of someone who had endured. He was used to being dismissed, used to watching truth be buried. But in his voice, Claudia could hear something she couldn't ignore: resolve. He didn't need to raise his voice or defend himself because every word he spoke carried the weight of years lived under oppression. The room fell into a frozen stillness, the remaining board members sitting in silence, none daring to speak. Each of them understood that the exchange between Darius and Claudia was not merely a personal confrontation, but a wake-up call for the entire collective. Truth doesn't vanish when denied. It simply waits until it gathers enough strength to break free, and when it does, everyone who stayed silent will have to pay the price. Claudia lowered her head, her vision blurred, unsure whether from anger, regret, or fear. She realized she had just crossed a line, one where Darius's honesty cast a light on her own vulnerability, and deep down, she knew he was right. The price of silence is never cheap. It takes more than people expect, from dignity, to justice, to peace of conscience. Darius sat still, saying nothing more. For him, what had been said was enough. The truth had been spoken, and it needed no further words. His eyes lit up for a moment, not with the glow of victory, but with the quiet belief that truth, once acknowledged, would clear the way for change that could no longer be stopped. After the tense hearing, the atmosphere in the boardroom still felt thick with suspicion and the weight of exposed lies. But the moment Claudia and Darius locked eyes, an unspoken signal passed between them. For the first time, between two people from vastly different positions, a silent understanding emerged. Claudia rose and walked toward Darius with steady steps, extended her hand, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I choose to stand with the truth." Without hesitation, Darius reached out, his firm hand clasping hers in a handshake that echoed louder than any justification, a declaration that the truth now had two defenders. Folders were laid neatly on the table, containing evidence Claudia had long gathered but never dared to reveal. Darius added what he had kept from the night he was pulled over by the police recordings that captured abuse of power and condescending tone. When placed together, those two pieces formed a full picture of the corrupt network. The remaining board members looked at each other in silence, knowing the truth had now outgrown their ability to conceal it. The evidence was too sharp, leaving no room for excuses. At the back row, Naomi stood close to her father, eyes glowing. She had never imagined the day would come when her single father, who quietly drove her to school every morning, could stand as an equal among the company's most powerful figures. In that moment, she no longer saw him as someone forced to stay silent, but as a strong man finally being treated with equal dignity. She bit her lip to hold back tears, but a proud smile curled on her lips. That handshake did more than unite two individuals, it marked the birth of a new alliance. Claudia, once haunted by silence, now found in Darius the strength to speak the truth. And Darius, long familiar with solitude, now knew he didn't have to fight alone. Their union turned helplessness into power, turned accusations into a chance to expose the system's true face. The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. Where suspicion had once choked the air, now came the tremor of truth breaking through. Eyes that once dismissed, Darius now looked at him with caution, and a few with newfound respect. As Claudia looked down at her hand, still warm from his grip, she knew this choice would bring consequences, but also that she could never return to silence. Naomi stepped closer, her small hand gripping her father's arm. In those shining eyes, Darius saw the trust he had fought to preserve all these years. He leaned down, nodding gently as if whispering a promise. "I won't let you be ashamed anymore." Naomi tightened her hold, her proud gaze fixed straight ahead, as if she too had become part of this new alliance. The room fell into silence, but it was no longer the kind born of oppression, it was the silence of undeniable acknowledgement. Claudia and Darius had chosen the harder path, but it was the only one that could bring the truth to light. And from that moment on, a new alliance had been formed, laying the foundation for what would come next, where justice was no longer just a word, but an act. Night settled over the city, the streets glowing endlessly with rows of streetlights, but in Darius's small apartment, the only light came from a lamp, casting a soft glow over his and Naomi's faces as they sat reading at the table. Suddenly, the phone rang, its shrill tone slicing through the calm. Darius glanced at the screen, saw an unfamiliar number, and immediately sensed something was wrong. He answered. On the other end, a hoarse voice cut in, broken yet full of threat. "Back off if you want peace. Don't think that handshake will save you. Stay silent, or someone will pay." Each word landed like a blow, the caller's ragged breathing echoing with disdain. Darius tightened his grip on the phone, eyes flicking toward Naomi, still engrossed in her book, unaware of the call. A wave of anger surged through him, but he kept his voice steady, answering slowly, each word dropping like stone. "I've lived with fear long enough. Not anymore." There was a pause on the other end, then a sharp click as the line disconnected, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Darius placed the phone down, his hand trembling slightly from adrenaline, but his eyes burned with resolve. He leaned back in his chair, mind drifting through the years behind him. He remembered the contempt he'd endured, the times he stayed silent against injustice just to protect his daughter, and Lena's face when classmates mocked her. All of it built the strength behind what he just said, without hesitation. Fear had been a longtime companion, but now, he refused to let it dictate his steps. He chose to confront it, knowing that staying silent one more time would mean losing everything. Naomi looked up, curious. "Who was that?" she asked. Darius smiled to reassure her, ruffling her hair as he said it was just a wrong number, but he knew better. The threat hadn't targeted him alone, it was a warning to the entire alliance. They wanted to snuff out the fire before it could grow. He looked at his daughter, eyes unwavering, silently vowing that he would never let those filthy hands reach into their lives. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Claudia received an anonymous warning text. She stared at the blinking screen, lips pressed into a firm line. She knew that standing with the truth would cost her the peace she once had. But when she recalled Darius's proud gaze during the hearing, she understood there was no turning back. The fear was still there, but beneath it rose a new kind of belief that together they might drag this entire web of lies into the light. Darius sat by the window, looking out at the distant lights, his hand slowly curling into a fist. That threat was nothing more than wind fueling the fire in his chest. He knew the days ahead would be brutal, but he also knew he had already crossed the line. There was no turning back now, and the truth had become his strongest weapon. Inside, he repeated his answer like a vow. "I've lived with fear long enough, not anymore." That night, the neighborhood was silent, only the wind rustling through narrow alleys and flickering streetlights, casting unsteady glows on the pavement. Darius had just put Naomi to sleep when a sharp, cracking noise shattered the quiet outside the window, followed by the acrid stench of paint. The large pane of glass had been smashed, shards scattering across the floor, streaks of red paint dripping down the white wall. Darius jumped up, heart pounding, and rushed to pull Naomi from bed just as another loud bang rang out, splattering fresh red paint across the front door. The once peaceful apartment turned into a battlefield, the smeared red blotches a declaration of war from faceless cowards. Naomi burst into frightened sobs, her trembling hands clinging tightly to her father, her small body curling into his solid embrace. Darius held her against his chest, shielding her from the falling shards of glass. He could feel her body trembling, hear the stifled sobs in the dark, and deep inside him, a storm of rage and heartbreak swelled. Whoever had done this wasn't just targeting him, they were trying to plant fear into the heart of an innocent child. He carried Naomi into the inner room, calming her in the steadiest voice he could summon. "You're safe. I'm here," he whispered, running his hand gently over her tousled hair. Naomi pressed in closer, tears soaking through his shirt, but even through the wide-eyed panic, a flicker of trust still shone in her eyes. Darius stayed there, holding her tightly, offering her small heart a place of safety in the midst of chaos. Outside, the sound of running footsteps, a revving engine, then silence. The paint throwers had vanished, leaving behind a wrecked apartment, shattered glass, and walls stained with an unsettling red. Darius knew this wasn't a random act, but a deliberate message: stay silent or face consequences. But he also knew, if they'd stooped to this level, it meant the truth he and Claudia held was finally threatening enough to make them afraid. He cleared away some of the glass, wiped the floor to prevent slipping, then sat Naomi back on the bed. She looked at him, her voice shaky. "Daddy, they really hate us, don't they?" Darius nodded slowly, then smiled, and placed a hand on her shoulder. "They hate because they're scared. When people fear the truth, they'll do anything to silence it. But you have to believe, we're stronger than their fear." Those simple words lit a small flame in Naomi's chest, and she nodded slightly, her breathing slowing, her hands no longer shaking. The night dragged on slowly, the paint stench still heavy in the air, the dim light from the small lamp casting a golden hue over Darius's thoughtful face. He sat by the shattered window, eyes scanning the empty street, his resolve stronger than ever. The red stains didn't deter him, if anything. They reminded him that the enemy was afraid of the truth. Inside, Naomi curled under her blanket, occasionally startled awake, reaching for her father's hand, and each time, Darius gave it a gentle squeeze to reassure her. In the stillness, he thought about what lay ahead, about the dangers still lurking. But his eyes lit up as he remembered the handshake with Claudia, remembered Naomi's tearful smile when she saw her father no longer bowing his head. Those images became the source of strength that helped him keep his promise, to no longer live in fear. As the first light of dawn crept in, streaks of red paint still clung to the wall like wounds yet to heal. But Darius didn't bow his head to them in shame. He saw them as proof, as markers showing that standing with the truth comes with attacks, but also as signs that the battle he chose was headed in the right direction. He turned to Naomi, who had fallen asleep after the panic, gently kissed her forehead, and whispered in his heart, "Last night only made us stronger." That threatening night had ended, leaving behind a wrecked apartment, but in Darius's heart, a new conviction had taken root. No threat could make him retreat now, because he knew well that behind fear lies truth, and behind truth is the future he wants to give his daughter. As the sound of engines faded into the far end of the street, a strange stillness settled over Darius's small apartment. He remained seated by the shattered window, eyes fixed on the smeared red paint like he was carving into memory the vile message sent by faceless enemies. His hand stayed on Naomi's shoulder, providing her a fragile peace in the fitful sleep following terror. At that moment, soft footsteps echoed in the hallway, then Claudia's silhouette appeared in the dim light. She had come, unannounced, and now stood witnessing the aftermath with her own eyes. Claudia stood silently at the half-open door, her gaze falling on the glittering shards of glass and the harsh stench of paint still hanging in the air. Her chest tightened, regret flooding in as she saw the cost Darius and his daughter had to bear simply for daring to join her in standing with the truth. The calm, composed expression she usually wore had vanished, replaced by an unmistakable look of sorrow. She didn't enter right away. She stood for a few seconds, quietly taking in the man sitting under the dim lamp, his eyes so unwavering they made her throat tighten. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but clear in the silent room. "You're not alone." Darius looked up, eyes bright in the dark, and saw Claudia standing there, her tall frame silhouetted against the hallway light. In that moment, all the exhaustion he'd carried for days seemed to lift, because for the first time, he heard a simple confirmation that carried immense weight. He didn't reply right away, only gave a small nod, but his eyes shone with a trust he had never shown before. Claudia stepped inside, each footstep quiet but firm. She walked across the broken glass without hesitation, as if wanting to share in some part of the pain. She looked at Naomi, asleep in fits, her small face half covered by shadows, tiny hands clutching the blanket. Claudia saw clearly how that innocence was now under threat by selfish, greedy adults. She turned to Darius and shook her head slightly. They don't just want to break you, they want to scare you into giving up. But we won't let them win. Darius listened, a wave of emotions rising within him that he couldn't quite name. For a moment, he recalled the hearing, remembered Claudia's eyes when she stood up and broke the silence. Now, here she was again in the dead of night, witnessing and acknowledging. He knew this wasn't just consolation, it was commitment. Her presence was like an anchor, keeping his ship from being swept away by the storm. Claudia pulled a chair closer and sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the shattered window. She stayed silent for a while, as if taking in the full weight of what had just happened. Then she spoke, her voice low but firm. I stayed silent too long, and that's why they grew so strong. But now, I'm done standing aside. You and I, we will expose the truth together. Darius turned to her, lips pressed tight, then gave a small nod. His answer was in his eyes, in the steady posture of his body, and in the calm certainty that his daughter was safe. Outside, the wind slipped through the cracks, carrying the pungent smell of paint, but the air inside the small apartment had shifted. It was no longer just the solitude of a father and child, there was now the presence of a true ally. Claudia brought not own promises but the weight of someone who had once stood at the center of power, and was now ready to stand alongside Darius. That night, 3 people shared the same space, each with a role, bound together by the same truth. Naomi, in her sleep, still shifted closer to her father, seeking safety. Darius sat quietly, eyes blazing with resolve. Claudia leaned back in her chair, silently observing, but inside, she had made her decision. She would never turn away again. Her words, "You're not alone," were not just reassurance, but a vow that this fight would no longer be his alone. The threatening night left behind more than red paint and broken glass. It marked a turning point. Where once Darius had stood alone, now he had someone beside him, someone who had seen, and who was willing to stay. And from that moment on, the path of resisting falsehood was no longer a solitary burden, but a shared journey, where the light of conviction slowly began to outshine the darkness of intimidation. The day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed, the atmosphere heavy, as if the entire city had turned its eyes to this place. The officers who had once wielded their power to suppress the truth now stood before the bench. The uniforms that once symbolized authority had become markers of corruption for the public. When the courtroom doors opened, every stare, every whisper of outrage rained down on them like a silent verdict before the judge even spoke. Darius entered with Claudia, his gaze calm but unyielding, while Naomi gripped her father's hand tightly from the gallery, drawing comfort from each steady step he took. As the prosecutor began reading the list of charges, the room seemed to thicken with tension. Evidence from the expanded investigation was laid out piece by piece: documents, video clips, years of manipulation and deceit brought to light. But just as the truth was being reassembled, one of the officers on trial suddenly shot to his feet, face flushed, voice exploding. "That guy's just an opportunist." The words were aimed straight at Darius, ringing out as a brazen provocation in the middle of the court. The courtroom erupted, some reporters immediately jotting down every word, cameras flashing non-stop. Darius didn't react right away. He simply turned, locking eyes with the man who was shouting with what little authority he had left. His stare was like steel, not angry but resolute, and it rendered the accusation hollow and weightless. The prosecutor signaled for order, and the judge struck the gavel 3 times, the sound of wood against wood slicing through the commotion like a blade. Claudia, seated beside him, quietly observed, seeing the contrast crystal clear in that moment. On one side, a man shouting to drown out the truth. On the other, a man silent, yet whose eyes alone could dismantle every accusation. She realized then that this was never just about evidence. It was a battle between dignity and collapse. In that moment, even the onlookers understood. When someone has to scream to stay relevant, their power is already crumbling. The prosecutor resumed, this time displaying a security recording from the night of the party. Darius carrying Victoria through a crowded lobby, his face serious, his arms steady to keep her from falling. Chaos swirled. Mocking laughter echoed. But that image said more than any testimony. The courtroom fell silent, and even the tapping of reporters' keyboards stopped. Everyone saw it for themselves. No force, no scheme, only a man stepping in to prevent a disaster. The officer who had shouted now stared down at the floor, but his venomous words still lingered in the air. Darius knew they would be repeated outside these walls, twisted into new doubts. But he no longer feared them, because the truth now had the light of justice shining upon it. He took a quiet breath and placed a hand on Naomi's shoulder. letting his daughter feel the strength in every breath he took. The judge recorded the testimony and called the next witness. Claudia stepped up to the stand, her eyes calm, her voice clear. She confirmed that Darius was the only one who ensured Victoria's safety that night, stating that all fabricated claims were merely tools to protect a rotten system. Her words rang out, unwavering, like a hammer striking straight at the wall of lies. The courtroom stirred again, but this time there were no whispers of doubt, only nods of agreement, eyes filled with respect. Darius returned to his seat, his heart pounding but his eyes alight. He knew the trial was far from over, that heated arguments would continue, but that moment proved one thing: the truth, once spoken, held the power to shake even the most impenetrable walls of authority. And when Naomi squeezed his hand tighter, he understood that this battle wasn't just about freeing himself, but about ensuring his daughter grew up in a world where justice wasn't buried beneath meaningless noise. Tension returned as the prosecutor stepped forward, a remote in his hand. He nodded to the judge, then turned toward the large screen in the center of the room. "Please, everyone, take a look," he said clearly. A video began to play, high-definition footage from a security camera capturing a crucial moment. On screen, Darius appeared calm and deliberate, carrying a heavily intoxicated Claudia through the chaos, gently setting her into a chair in the lobby. No aggression, no ulterior motive. Every movement spoke of restraint and responsibility. All eyes in the courtroom locked on the screen. The murmurs that had flared up after the officer's outburst dissolved into a heavy silence. In the frame, the crowd laughed, several people recording with their phones. But the most striking image was Darius, his face tense, his eyes focused solely on the task of getting the woman to safety. These details dismantled every false claim, shattering the narrative of the opportunist the opposing side had tried to build. The courtroom remained silent, a silence unlike the earlier tension. This was the stillness that followed truth being laid bare. Those who once doubted had no words left. A few cameras clicked, then stopped, because the footage needed no further explanation. Darius sat upright, eyes moving from the screen back to Naomi, who clutched his hand tightly. He knew this moment mattered not just for him, but for her. It proved that resolve is never meaningless, that the days of humiliation and mockery were not without answer. He didn't smile, but his eyes shone with pride, quietly radiating a strength that made his accusers lower their gaze. Claudia, seated in the witness box, closed her eyes as the footage played. She remembered the haze of that night, the steady tone of Darius reassuring her, and now, it was all there, public, undeniable. She opened her eyes and let the truth speak for her, because no words could carry more weight than that video. The judge remained silent, his stern eyes revealing a faint flicker of satisfaction at the clarity of the evidence. He tapped his gavel lightly, not to declare a verdict, but to cut through the silence that had stretched too long. That simple gesture affirmed what needed to be seen had been seen. In the press row, journalists who once thrived on sensational headlines now quietly typed a different narrative. They could no longer ignore the undeniable proof, could no longer fuel rumors when the truth had just played out before their eyes. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted, from a space clouded with suspicion to a place where truth stood as irrefutable evidence. When the screen went dark, silence still reigned. No one spoke. Each person was lost in their own thoughts. For many, that moment was a shock, forcing them to confront the fact that they had believed the wrong story, had joined in on the smear. For Darius, it was the clearest confirmation that the belief he'd held onto until now had finally been justified. And in that moment, no matter how crowded the room, no one dared deny that the truth had finally claimed its place. After several days of litigation, all evidence and testimonies had finally been thoroughly examined. The jury returned to the courtroom with solemn expressions, every eye in the room following their every step. The foreperson stood, holding a sheet of paper, and read the verdict aloud in complete silence. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, we unanimously find that the group of officers fabricated statements to protect their own interests. This constitutes perjury and obstruction of justice. The sound of the gavel echoed, affirming a decision that could not be overturned. The courtroom erupted with murmurs. Some people exhaled in relief, others slumped in their seats in shock, while reporters quickly relayed the news of a verdict that would shift the entire course of the case. Amid the commotion, Claudia stood, her eyes locked on the judge, then swept across the crowded room, her voice raspy but firm. "I must say this. For too long, I let pride blind me. I believed silence would protect my reputation and the company's, but the truth is that pride allowed lies to spread. I accept responsibility for the collapse we see today." Her admission rang out, quieting the room. The once restless crowd now listened intently, for what they heard was not just self-reflection, but the removal of power's final disguise. Darius sat silently, absorbing every word. He felt no satisfaction, no judgment, but a deep sense of relief. Claudia's willingness to publicly admit her fault was not only her own redemption, but proof that truth had truly prevailed. He nodded gently, eyes turning to Naomi, so she would understand that patience and courage had finally brought results. Naomi tightened her grip on his hand, eyes lit with new belief, as if justice were no longer an abstract ideal but something now clearly visible. The atmosphere in the courtroom had completely shifted. Where suspicion and division once loomed, now stood undeniable clarity. Members of the company board, seated among the audience, wore pale faces. They could no longer deny the failures that let the corrupt network thrive, nor ignore the public confession they had just witnessed. A heavy silence spread, but this time it wasn't silence meant to hide. It was silence forced by truth. The judge struck the gavel again, his voice firm as he declared, "Sentencing for the involved officers will be announced next week. But today, we acknowledge that justice cannot be distorted. No one has the right to bury the truth with arrogance and deceit." That statement echoed, becoming a message for everyone present in the room. Claudia sat down, her shoulders relaxed as if a weight had just been lifted, while Darius raised his head high, the pride in his eyes once again shining bright. The verdict hadn't ended everything, but it marked a turning point. The truth had been acknowledged, and those who fabricated lies had bowed before justice. In that moment, everyone in the room understood that a new chapter had begun, one where transparency stood at the top, and arrogance and deceit would no longer have a place to hide. The courtroom still lingered in heavy silence after Claudia's confession, as if everyone were waiting for one final voice to bring the session to a close. Darius slowly rose, his hand resting gently on Naomi's shoulder, as if to remind himself of the only reason he was standing here. He didn't look around, didn't seek sympathy, his eyes focused only on the judge. His voice rang out calm and steady, not loud, not trembling, but carrying the weight of everything he'd endured. "I just want to raise my daughter with kindness." That short sentence dropped like another gavel strike, not from the bench, but from the heart of a father. It pierced through the room, cutting through doubt, through the cruelty many had once hurled. In that moment, all the accusations, the calculated reports, the cheap rumors shrank beside the simplicity of one truth: a man who wanted to raise his child with kindness. Naomi looked up at her father, her clear eyes shining, lips parted as if to say something, but the emotion caught her words. She saw now how different her father was from what the media had painted, from the cruel whispers at school. Standing in court, her father was not a man on trial, but a man showing the world the strength of integrity. The silence lasted only seconds, then was broken by the sudden scrape of a chair. An audience member stood, clapping hard. The sound echoed through the packed room, at first alone, then quickly joined. A second, a third, then entire rows rose, their hands clapping in waves that couldn't be stopped. The applause wasn't only for Darius, but for the truth that had been buried too long, and was finally revealed. Darius looked around, and for the first time allowed himself a smile. Not a smile of victory, but one of quiet relief, like a breath released after years of being held in. He didn't bow, didn't wave, he just stood there, hand gripping Naomi's shoulder, to show her that the applause was for what he had held onto all these years. Claudia sat still, but her eyes glistened with emotion. She understood that if she had chosen silence one more time, this moment might never have come. Darius's courage hadn't only protected himself, but it had pulled her, and many others, out of the grip of cowardice. She bowed her head, letting the emotion rise, silently promising herself she would never hide the truth again. Reporters typed frantically, but this time, no one tried to twist the words. They understood that to distort them now would be to betray what they had just witnessed. The line, "I just want to raise my daughter with kindness," quickly became the headline on breaking news reports, and that resounding applause would be recorded as an indelible moment. Naomi still held her father's hand tightly, her eyes bright as she looked around the courtroom. She knew that from now on, classmates would no longer dare to mock her, and those with cruel intentions would have no more ground to smear. Pride swelled in her chest, because her father had not only protected her but had shown the world the power of kindness. The trial closed with the sound of applause still echoing like a lasting reverberation. As they stepped outside, the radiant afternoon light bathed the courthouse steps. Darius held Naomi's hand, his stride firmer than ever. He knew the road ahead would be long, but he also knew one vital truth. The truth had been upheld, and kindness had become the strongest shield for both father and daughter. After the thunderous applause in the courtroom, the following events unfolded swiftly, like a flood washing away everything old and rotten. The official verdict triggered a shockwave across the entire system. The officers who once shouted with authority, who had signed off on false testimonies, were now dismissed en masse. Their names appeared in the press not as symbols of order, but as living proof of corrupted power. They were stripped of their badges, removed from the force under the scornful gaze of the public. Those who once hid behind the blue uniform to trample others, now had to face the truth that abuse of power always comes at a cost. Public outrage surged, sparking widespread debates on forums and in the streets. People were furious to realize they had been deceived for so long, yet relieved that justice had not been buried forever. Families who had suffered at the hands of the same corrupt officers began to speak out, shedding light on stories long suppressed. Darius read the news, one headline after another, and saw that he was not alone in this journey, because the truth had not only saved him but also opened the door for many others to find their voice. At the same time, the company where Victoria had held leadership was forced to announce sweeping reforms. The collapse of its covert alliance with law enforcement had become too visible to deny. The board of directors released a plan to sever all ties with the corrupt network, terminate shady contracts, and rebuild the organization on principles of transparency. Those who had used backdoor connections to rise through the ranks were immediately removed. Departments once complicit in covering for one another were now under strict review. Victoria stepped before the press, and for the first time in her career, she did not avoid questions, nor did she wear a cold facade to mask the truth. She publicly declared that the company must cleanse itself, that trust can only be regained through action, not empty promises. The image left a strong impression, as the public understood that the fall of the corrupt alliance had come not only from outside pressure, but from insiders willing to face the truth head-on. Darius watched all these changes unfold with quiet resolve. He sought no revenge, nor did he wish to be hailed as a hero. For him, the most important thing was that Naomi could now walk tall, no longer mocked by classmates, no longer living under a shadowed childhood. He knew justice couldn't erase all wounds, but at the very least, it proved that steadfastness and kindness could make a difference. The price of abuse wasn't just empty seats in the police ranks or canceled contracts, but a lasting warning etched into society. People understood that power, when misused, would ultimately crush those who wielded it. And conversely, truth, no matter how long it's buried, will always find a way to rise and make the liars pay. In the small apartment, Darius watched Naomi sleep soundly after her first full day back at school. He whispered softly, as if sending a message into the future. "Everything will be different now, sweetheart. We made it through." The sound of the night wind outside brought a sense of peace, so different from the chaos of the days before. He knew the storm had passed, but the lessons it carried would remain, reminding him and the world that justice is not a gift, but the result of courage in the face of abuse. The next day, newspaper stands were filled with bold headlines stretched across the front pages, images of Darius in the courtroom with his proud gaze appearing everywhere. There were no distortions, no sensational twists this time. The media chose a tone of respect. The single father who taught a lesson in justice. The photo of him tightly holding Naomi's hand in the courtroom was printed prominently, accompanied by long articles analyzing how an ordinary man became a symbol of resilience, armed only with kindness and persistence in standing up to injustice. Even tabloids that typically thrived on scandal couldn't ignore the clarity of truth, and were forced to acknowledge the power of the story the entire society had been watching. At school, Naomi heard her classmates talking about her father. There were no more sneers, no more cruel whispers behind her back. Instead, there were curious and admiring glances. Some kids brought in newspapers, proudly showing that they had read the story, even bragging about being in the same class as the daughter of the single father who taught a lesson in justice. Naomi blushed, but her heart swelled with pride. She no longer walked with her head down, but held it high, her eyes glowing with newfound confidence. That afternoon, on the way home from school, Naomi stopped by the small newsstand on the corner. She bought a paper and clutched it to her chest like a treasure. Seeing her father's image on the front page made her heart race, not because it was news, but because it was recognition from the world. When she reached the apartment, she ran into Darius's arms, held up the paper with a beaming smile, and hugged him tightly, as if to say all the hardship they had endured was finally worth it. Darius looked down at the pride shining in his daughter's eyes and gently kissed her forehead, his heart overwhelmed by a peace he had never known. He spread the newspaper on the table, his eyes landing on the bold headline. Deep down, Darius knew he wasn't a hero, he was just a father trying to protect his daughter and live by his conscience. But seeing Naomi so joyful, he realized the impact of what he had done extended beyond their small family. It had rippled outward, becoming an example for those who had suffered injustice, offering them proof that truth can prevail, and that kindness is not weakness. Claudia read those articles too, sitting alone in her quiet office. She turned each page, her mind unsettled. The images of Darius and Naomi brought back the moment she chose to stand up, and she knew that choice had saved her from the grip of pride. For the first time in years, Claudia felt relieved, knowing that one person's honor was no longer buried, and that she had helped bring it into the light. She told herself she would continue the work of reforming the company to ensure stories like this would never happen again. Naomi placed the newspaper on her desk, carefully folding it as if preserving a precious keepsake. She didn't know how long reporters would remember the story, but to her, that moment would last forever. Each time she looked at the photo, she saw her father standing tall in court, his back straight and his eyes proud. It was an image she would carry with her for life, a reminder that kindness is always stronger than any lie. That evening, the two of them sat at the dinner table, warm light casting soft golden reflections across the room. Naomi hugged her father again, whispering, "I'm happy because I have you." Darius held her tightly, emotion rising in his chest. He knew this journey had cost them tears and pain, but in return, it gave them a victory greater than any verdict, the triumph of truth. And in his daughter's embrace, he silently vowed that from now on, they would live fully by the simplest thing, being kind to themselves and to the world. That night, their small apartment felt warmer than ever. Naomi's bright laughter echoed through the room, drowning out the dark memories that once lingered. Darius sat quietly, his heart lighter than he could remember. Outside, the city buzzed with news and noise, but inside the little home, there were only the two of them holding each other and an old newspaper, the proof of the justice journey they had walked together. In the days following the trial, Claudia lived with a strange new feeling. She no longer hid behind endless meetings or pages of dense reports, but began to face herself, to look back at the years she had allowed pride to obscure the light of truth. One afternoon, as the last rays of sunlight fell over the city, she decided to visit Darius. Not as a boss, not as a person in power at the company, but simply as one human being indebted to another. As she climbed the familiar stairs to the small apartment where he and his daughter lived, Claudia felt her heart grow lighter, as if she, too, were shedding the invisible chains that had bound her for so long. The door opened, and Darius looked up, his gaze calm, no longer guarded as it once was. Naomi stood behind him, watching the woman who had once symbolized power in the company now appear at their doorstep with a rare humility. Claudia bowed her head slightly, her voice slow, each word carefully chosen. "You saved me from both lies and pride." The confession brought a heavy silence into the room. Naomi held her father's hand, while Darius looked directly at Claudia, his eyes showing no sense of victory, only the steady calm of someone who had endured too much loss. Claudia stepped in and sat on a plain wooden chair, so different from the polished office chairs she was used to. She spoke, not with the tone of a leader, but with the voice of someone laying down a burden. She talked about the sleepless nights, seeing her name in the news, tied to scandals she should have stopped. She admitted that it was pride that had kept her silent, pride that had made her complicit, and if it hadn't been for Darius, she might have remained in that darkness forever. Darius listened, his eyes never leaving Claudia. He understood she was seeking release, not to erase her faults, but to move forward with a different mindset. He said quietly, his tone even, "What matters is that you chose to change. The truth was hidden for a while, but it found its way back. Now, you can decide how you'll use the power you still have." The words carried no demand, no accusation, but struck directly at the heart of the matter, and Claudia felt her throat tighten. Naomi watched the scene with wide-eyed curiosity and admiration. She didn't fully grasp the complexities of the adult world, but she sensed that her father had become a pillar even for those who once stood above him. In her young mind, he wasn't just a protector anymore, he was someone who could inspire change. She sat quietly, hugging her textbook, occasionally looking up at his face, as if trying to memorize this moment forever. Claudia remained silent for a long while, then finally looked up, her eyes clearer than when she had arrived. She added softly but with resolve, "I won't let the company be a tool for lies anymore. I was wrong to think silence protected reputation. Now I want to protect it with transparency, and I want you to know that you showed me that path." Those words made the air in the small apartment feel warmer, not because of the light, but because of the trust just shared. Darius nodded, offering no praise or promise, simply accepting the commitment. He knew that real change in a person couldn't be measured by words but by action. Yet in Claudia's eyes, he saw sincerity, saw the desire to begin again. That was enough for him to open a door. He said, "It won't be easy, you'll face resistance, but if you've made your choice, see it through. I won't turn away if truth is what you stand for." Claudia smiled faintly, a relieved smile she hadn't worn in years of living under pressure. She stood, looked at Darius and Naomi one last time before leaving, feeling genuine gratitude. She hadn't come just to say thank you, but to begin again, to give herself a chance to step out from behind her old armor. As the door closed, Naomi turned to her father and asked quietly, "Dad, do you think she's really changed?" Darius looked at her, gently ran a hand through her hair, then replied, "Change is hard, but with enough courage, anyone can do it. What matters is holding on to the truth." Naomi smiled and leaned against him, reassured by the idea that even those who once caused them pain could still find the light. That night, Darius sat silently by the window, watching the city lights flicker. He thought about Claudia's words, about the shift in her, and felt a lightness in his chest. He knew the road ahead was still long, but the fact that someone who once stayed silent had now chosen to speak up was a sign that his efforts hadn't been in vain. And in that moment, he understood that kindness didn't just protect his daughter. It held the power to change even hearts once clouded by prideful darkness. Outside the window, the city lights streamed in, drawing long streaks across the stained wall, still marked by paint from the night of the attack. It stood as proof that darkness still existed, but light could not be extinguished. Claudia sighed. For the first time in years, she no longer felt the need to maintain a hardened exterior. She accepted her vulnerability, and the truth that power did not make one stronger if all it shielded was concealment. That heavy silence became a catalyst, pushing her to truly reflect, to realize that the road ahead would be hard, but at least she had taken the first step. Darius said nothing more, sitting still and letting the silence stretch. In that quiet, Naomi pressed close to him, her thoughtful gaze suggesting she was absorbing a lesson no classroom could teach. She felt her father protected her not just with his strength, but with his honesty, a weapon powerful enough to make even the most powerful bow. Claudia looked at the scene, her throat tightening. She realized it was Naomi's presence, her innocence, her quiet resilience that had helped shape Darius into an unshakable pillar. Time moved slowly in the room. Outside, the hum of traffic faded, leaving the stillness even more pronounced. Claudia finally raised her head, eyes brimming but gaze steadier. She didn't respond to Darius's earlier words, knowing no reply could refute them. Instead, she gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that only by facing the truth could she step out of the darkness. That silent moment became a turning point. It didn't just connect two people from vastly different worlds, it opened the door to real change. Claudia understood she would have to do far more than make promises, while Darius knew he couldn't rely on another's remorse. Yet, in that single second, they shared a recognition. Justice never begins with applause, but with the courage to face oneself. Naomi looked up at the two adults, gripping her father's hand tightly, as if holding on to the lesson she had just witnessed. She didn't need to grasp all its layers to know the silence mattered, that it wasn't empty but full of meaning. That night, as Claudia left, her figure trembling slightly under the dim hallway light, Darius remained seated, eyes thoughtful, letting the stillness envelop them. Naomi leaned her head against his shoulder, sighing softly, and the deep silence lingered like a reminder that the road to justice always begins with the moment one dares to face the truth. That morning, the small street was bathed in sunlight. Darius and Naomi walked slowly, their steps in sync like a familiar rhythm. After all the exhausting days, they could finally stroll the usual path without lowering their heads or avoiding anyone's gaze. The sunlight cast long streaks on the ground, and their shadows stretched side by side, steady and close. Naomi looked up, the breeze ruffling her hair, her clear eyes reflecting the morning light. She turned to her father and asked, her voice curious yet hesitant, "Dad, can everyone really change?" The innocent question echoed, like a weighty equation of life. Darius paused, looking at his daughter with gentle eyes. He knew she wasn't only asking about Claudia or those who had once gone astray, but about the world itself, where good and bad always coexist. He gently held her hand and replied in a calm, steady voice, "Change isn't easy, but everyone has a chance if they dare to face the truth. Some turn away, some confront it, and that choice defines who they become." His words fell slowly, like a soft melody, making Naomi nod, her eyes thoughtful. They kept walking, passing the familiar row of houses. A neighbor paused to greet them, and some who recognized Darius no longer looked at him with scorn, but with respect. Naomi noticed, and pride swelled in her heart. She understood that wounds don't heal easily, but the change in people's eyes was proof that justice had done its part. On the sunlit street, Darius told his daughter what he had learned. That justice never comes from silence. That kindness must be upheld even when the world turns away. Naomi listened, her eyes wide, absorbing every word. She gently squeezed her father's hand and whispered, "I'll always remember, Dad." Darius smiled softly, placing his hand on her shoulder, his heart filled with the belief that it is the next generation where lasting change takes root. The sky above was a clear blue, no clouds in sight, and the light seemed to cleanse the scene after so many stormy days. Darius knew his journey wasn't over, but this moment reminded him that every hardship, every trial, had meaning. He had not only protected his daughter, but also planted in her heart a belief in kindness. Naomi, with her innocent yet profound question, was proof that the lessons they had lived would not stay in the past, but grow with time. And so the two of them walked on under the sun, leaving behind faded red paint, silenced rumors, and the darkness that once surrounded them. Ahead was a long road, but bright, opening to a future where truth no longer had to hide. In every step, that lesson became their compass, as Darius and Naomi moved forward calm but unshakable. Naomi tilted her head slightly, waiting for her father's answer, her eyes shimmering in the sunlight. Darius paused, looking at his daughter as if to make sure that every word he was about to say would be etched into her memory. He smiled gently, a smile calm and seasoned, then replied, "If they dare to face the truth." The words rang out, short but heavy, like a message not just meant for this private exchange between father and daughter, but for all those who had once lost their way in pride, who had chosen silence to avoid confronting the dark. Naomi nodded softly, her small hand tightening around his, feeling safe and guided by the certainty in his voice. They kept walking under the sun, no more words needed, letting the silence between them carry everything. Darius knew his daughter had understood that change doesn't come from empty promises, but from the courage to face oneself. He saw in Naomi's eyes no longer the innocence of a child, but the early signs of maturity shaped by painful yet necessary experiences. To him, that was the greatest reward after everything they had endured, because the most important lesson was not meant for the outside world, but for the child he loved most. The morning light poured in, casting long, steady shadows of the two figures walking side by side. The city's noise slowly faded behind them, giving way to a sense of calm. In Darius's heart, each step carried new meaning, not just as a single father fighting injustice, but as the beginning of a future where Naomi would grow up believing kindness always has a place. He knew the road ahead would still be full of trials, but that belief alone was enough to keep him going, unshaken. Their story ended in that light, but its echo was stronger than ever. It wasn't just a memory of a courtroom, of those who abused power being exposed, or of headlines praising a single father. It was proof of a simple truth: kindness is stronger than any false power. That message spread beyond their small apartment, beyond the ordinary streets, into the hearts of those who had witnessed it, read about it, or heard it retold. It served as a reminder that truth may be buried for a time, but it will rise, and when it does, it carries a force that cannot be silenced. To Naomi, her father's words would become the compass for her life. To Darius, today's quiet smile was proof that his journey had not been in vain. And to all who followed their story, it ended but did not vanish, leaving behind a reminder that cannot fade. Power may crumble, fame may fall, but kindness is the only thing that truly endures. The story of Darius and Naomi began at a party that seemed harmless, where glittering lights hid sneers and mocking laughter. From the moment he was forced to escort Victoria home in her drunken state, their world turned upside down. Prejudices, accusations, and the cowardice of those in power turned him into the target of countless lies. Yet from that very place, the journey of a man who only wanted to live quietly with his daughter became a beacon of light for many others. Throughout that journey, Darius faced scorn from colleagues, humiliation from the police force, and schemes from a hidden network of power. He didn't respond with anger, but upheld his dignity through steady silence. That silence wasn't surrender, but the way he held firm until the truth found its moment to be heard. And that moment came, not by chance, but through his unwavering resolve and the awakening of those willing to face the truth among them. Claudia. Claudia, once a figure of power, had let pride cloud her conscience. She stayed silent in the face of wrongdoing to protect her reputation, but it was Darius's steadfastness that forced her to confront her own darkness. When she chose to step forward and admit the truth, it dragged the entire hidden system into the light. She no longer approached him as a superior, but as someone grateful to the man who saved her from the spiral of deceit. Her transformation became proof that anyone can start over if they have the courage to face the truth. The trial marked the climax of the entire journey. There, the false accusations were torn apart by evidence, and those who wore justice as a mask to conceal wrongdoing were exposed. The image of Darius carrying Victoria safely through the crowd ended every rumor. The moment he stood up and calmly declared that all he ever wanted was to raise his daughter with kindness, shook the entire courtroom. The thunderous applause that day wasn't just for one man, but for a truth that had been buried for far too long. Naomi, the small witness to it all, had been by her father's side from the beginning. Her innocent eyes reflected all the pain and every moment of rebirth. When classmates mocked, when she saw her father insulted, she still held his hand tightly, a reminder that this fight wasn't only one man's, it was a small family stand against an unjust system. And when she held the newspaper calling her father, the single father who taught a lesson in justice, Naomi understood that every hardship they endured had transformed into a brilliant source of pride. The price of abuse of power was an inevitable collapse. Dozens of officers were dismissed, the company was forced to reform, and all covert ties were severed. Society witnessed the truth. False power can only last so long, but justice, however delayed, will come. The change didn't stop at the verdict, but rippled through the community, where people began speaking up more for what was right, where kindness was finally seen as a value worth defending. For Claudia, awakening freed her from the shackles of pride. For Darius, the journey to prove the truth turned him into a symbol of inner strength. For Naomi, those days became an indelible lesson that living kindly and having the courage to face the truth is what truly makes a person strong. And for society, this story serves as a reminder that truth needs no disguise. It only needs to be preserved with persistence until it asserts itself. As the father and daughter walked in the sunlight, Naomi asked if anyone could truly change. Darius responded with a simple but profound answer: if they dare to face the truth. That reply was the essence of the entire journey, not only meant to comfort his daughter, but to send a message to all. Because change is not impossible, it begins the moment one has the courage to face their mistakes and choose to stand with the truth. The story comes to a close, but its message continues to resonate. It's not just about a single father and his young daughter, but about the power of kindness, about the ability to heal and even change systems when people choose to stand firm. In a world where power can be abused, where falsehood easily masks justice, this story reminds us that kindness is the strongest shield. It doesn't just protect one person, it rekindles hope for an entire community. The lesson left behind doesn't lie in someone winning, but in the fact that everyone is reminded that justice doesn't belong to the powerful, but to the persistent. Power may collapse, reputations may fade, but kindness will endure, like a light, guiding anyone brave enough to step through the darkness. And that is the most fitting ending to the story. Kindness is stronger than any false power.